Good morning, everyone. How are you? Everybody doing well? Good.
Doing good, thanks.
We're going to go through in just a second and have folk introduce themselves. We have a number of people that were not able to join us for various reasons, and I hope are joining us on the phone. So after we introduce ourselves in person, we will ask for the folk that are on the phone to introduce themselves. I'll start this whole process. Diane Todd Sprague, currently chair. This is my last meeting as chair. Robert will be taking over starting in November. University of Texas at Austin. Brent, you want to start?
Brent Williford, Blinn College Financial Aid.
Samantha Stoniker, Tarrant County College.
Denise Welch, Panola College.
Delisa Fox, TASFA, Texas Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, and I'm with Texas A&M.
And I'm Selma DeLeon, University of North Texas.
Robert Marino, San Ysidro College.
Chad Pulse, Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board.
Ed Cressley, Angelo State University.
Carla Flores, University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley.
Kara Tappendorf, Weiss High School, Pflugerville ISD.
Shannon Crossland, Texas Tech University.
Technical College. And Alan Bixley, Collin College.
Well, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Welcome. Nice to see you.
And Raul's term will, if approved by the board, will start in November.
Great. Will the folk on the line please identify themselves?
Hi, Kelly here from Amarillo College.
This is Tom Wynn from UNC Health Science Center.
Heidi Granger, University of Texas at El Paso.
Anyone else?
Okay. Paul Gallion, Jacksonville College.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. A couple of quick housekeeping items. If y'all will please make sure that your cell phones are on silent, and anytime that you speak, if you would make sure that your microphone is on, it helps with the recording of the sessions. I will start with one point that Chad brought up this morning. I'm going to ask that folk consider for November nominations for vice chair. That will be occurring at that meeting. So just give that some consideration in preparation for that meeting. We'll move on the agenda. Consideration for approval of minutes. I'll give everyone a few moments to take a look at this and see if there are any corrections or changes that need to be made. Okay. Alan, do you have a comment?
No, just make a motion to approve the minutes.
Okay, great. Yes, ma'am.
I do have a correction on page 6. Under Senate Bill 499, that last sentence, submit a letter, and Zelma and Alan went to the Capitol support. Actually, Alan and I created the letter, but Delisa and Chris, Dr. Muir, and Jimmy Parker went to the Capitol.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you were saying. Yeah,
No,
thank
okay.
you.
So when it says submit a letter, and it says submit a letter, Zelma and Alan went to the Capitol. So Zelma and Alan actually created the letter, and then I submitted it, and then myself, Chris Murr, and Jimmy Parker went to the Capitol for support to Senator Seliger's letter.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. Anything else? Okay, we'll go back to Alan's motion to approve. Second, Denise, all in favor? Perfect, thank you. Do want to let you all know that we're going to be jumping around a little bit in the agenda because of people's schedules. So we are going to go, instead of to C, item C, we're going to head straight to item E, update external relations. John Wyatt. I'm sorry, are we?
Sorry.
What are we not doing? I'm on an old one. Okay, sorry. Let me go to this. Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry, wrong agenda. So we're actually heading to presentation E, overview of college access loan bond funding, Ken Martin.
Good morning.
Morning.
What Chad asked me to do is talk a little bit about the College Access Loan Program and give you a little bit of update. You understand the loan program itself from you get money, the student requests funding from us. But what we want to do is give you a little perspective on how do we get the money? How do we fund the program that actually gets this to students and allows them access and completion to college? So that's what I'm here to do today. I also want to touch base on a couple positive legislative changes that came out of this session. We worked hard for a couple items that really have some positive impacts to this program and to other issuers. So. As you know, we have really 3 active loan programs. The Be On Time program is being phased out. We anticipate this will be our last year. A few loans are going through right now and have been requested, but we anticipate that'll be completed this year. We will not have funding for the following year other than administration, of which we anticipate will occur, but for about the next 15 years, both servicing existing loans and any defaulted loans that we have. We have the Armed Services Scholarship Program. Not all institutions participate in that. It's funded by general revenue, but it is for ROTC programs. So items such as the Corps at A&M and any other institution, public or private, that has an ROTC program may have a student that was nominated by legislature would be participating in this program. It's fairly small. We only have about $15 million outstanding. You can see compared to the Be On Time of $180 million. And then really what I'm here to talk about is our College Access Loan Program, where we have around $1.4 billion of student loans outstanding. That's really the largest and the longest running loan program that this agency has. It started back in 1965 with the Hinson-Hazelwood Act, and that really initiated the beginning of this program as well as the beginning of the Higher Education Coordinating Board. Fun fact, the program was actually approved approximately 3 weeks prior to the Federal Higher Education Act, which funded federal student loans. So the state was really on top of it back then in 1965. Imagine the cost of higher education back then compared to now. It is supported by tax-exempt general revenue bonds. What does that mean? We issue debt. We go out and we issue money, debt to investors. These are wholly owned securities. So these are bonds that are governed by the IRS for the tax-exempt status, by the Securities Exchange Commission because they are marketable securities. And we do go to market approximately every year to issue bonds for new funding to fund the current year or the preceding year's student loans. First bonds were issued in 1966, $10 million, and that lasted a couple years actually of funding for student loans. That would only last us probably about 2 weeks in the period we're in right now with demand. We've issued the agency over the time period since 1966 over $3 billion worth of bonds. The bonds that we issue, I'll show you kind of how the money flows, but basically we issue the money, investors give bonds, the investors give us money, and we use that money to give to your institutions for the students to fund their higher education. The borrower, students, graduate, hopefully, and then they're repaying us once they get back into repayment status, have a job. Those repayments then come back to us, and that's utilized to help pay our investors. So that's how we are able to pay the bonds off. Current interest rate, as you all know, is 5.2%. We do not capitalize the interest while they're in school. So that's a benefit that we provide that a lot of issuers do not, which helps long-term for the student. And the program, the main item here is the program's self-sufficient. It does not use tax revenue, has not used tax revenue to support itself. We basically, as I stated, with the interest rate and the repayments coming back from borrowers, the excess of those repayments that we don't need for our debt will go to actually fund administration of the program, or we'll utilize sometimes those funds to issue more student loans. So here's a little bit of a flow chart, if you will, of how the money goes. I'm not going to turn you into accountants here, but I will just talk at very high level. If you start in the upper left, the issue, the GO bonds, that's the sale. So we go to investors, we go to market at whatever point in time, and there's many steps we have to take just to get to that point. A board resolution, bond review board approval, Office of Attorney General approves a final term of the sale, etc. Once we get the money's deposited in the comptroller. So we do not keep it in our own account. As an agency, we do not maintain independent accounts. A lot of institutions will have institutional funds. We maintain these funds with the comptroller in a particular fund. Think of a fund with the comptroller as a particular account, but it's just dedicated for us. And we pass the money on to the institutions. So the money goes to the institutions. Every financial aid office, business office gets the money, not directly to the students, and then it gets either applied to their account or dispersed to the students, depending on their need. As I mentioned before, borrower loan payments come back to us, and then that helps us get into the interest sinking fund. That builds up a balance, and twice a year we pay our debt in the other red box. The excess payments at the bottom, as I mentioned, that will then go to a different fund that does not have debt to it and has been in existence since the inception of the program, and we can use that for either additional loans or to fund the administration of the program each year. So a little bit of high-level information. You all see what you request, but on an overall basis, these are just kind of some statistics that you can see. But borrower payments, we receive about $145 million annually that's coming back to the institution. We have debt service around $110 to $120 million. That goes up over time as we keep issuing bonds. Our administrative costs are only about $13 million annually. So as you can see, we get a little bit of a differential there, and that's what helps fund the administration. We have $1.2 billion of bonds outstanding. So we have $1.4 billion of loans outstanding. We have $1.2 billion of bonds outstanding. Now our bonds are limited. They're capped at a constitutional limit of $1.86 billion. So we would have to go back to voters of the state to increase that. And that'll probably occur sometime around the mid-20s, 2025, 27. We may need to do that, depending on volume. Of note, we've recently, we try to balance our debt that we have outstanding, just like you would with a home. You have a home mortgage. And if you had a home mortgage, it's at 5%, and your mortgage rates today are around 3.5%. It may behoove you to refinance that if you had 20 years left on your term. Why would you do that? Well, over the life of that 20-year term, say, or remaining term, you're going to save money because you lowered your payments. Well, we do the same with our bonds. So after 10 years, they are refundable or callable. And so investors that hold on to them, we can issue new bonds at today's rates, lower rates, to then refund older bonds that may be at a higher rate. And we did that this year. We had 3 older bond series that we refunded, which will yield into the future approximately $50 million of savings to the program, of which allows us to then put back into the program by keeping the interest rate lower than may necessarily be needed to pay the bonds that you utilized that year for those loans. So if I issue bonds today in 2019 and we issue loans for this academic year, we may need an interest rate of X because we're paying investors Y, and we may need to make sure we're getting enough back, cover default, et cetera. Well, when we're refunding bonds and producing savings, I can take some of that savings and maybe lower the interest rate. Maybe I don't need exactly a set interest rate this time. I'll lower the interest rate because some of those bonds that are out there that we refunded will produce some of that savings in the future. So a couple things just to touch base on with what transpired in legislature, and these will have positive impacts to both students and postgraduate students who have graduated as well. One of them was 1474, Senate Bill 1474. This was really a bipartisan bill. We worked with many entities, Department of Housing and Community Affairs, TSHAC, some housing finance corporations. We worked with Senator Lucio's office, et cetera, and we're able to get this bill to pass unanimously in both House and the Senate. What it did is it changed Texas Government Code 1372, which is the statute that has the oversight for these tax-exempt bonds that we issue. It also changed a portion of the Education Code to reauthorize some issuers that previously issued student loans to get them back in, and I'll talk about that in a second. What it does for us, I'm not going to go into detail, but in that statute, it limits how much we can make one request at a time. And in the past, it was $75 million. Well, over 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, that would suffice for the College Access Loan Program. Once a year, we probably were issuing a total of $75 million of loans. We're issuing now $160 to $170 million of loans in total in dollars. So we were not able to use a provision in the statute, and by doing some other things, we had to wait until August 15th, one day out of the entire year, to be able to get enough funding to fund the program. That was working for a couple years, but then affordable housing is also running up against the same situation. Costs of building, costs of construction in general are going up. So they were waiting until August 15th, and it was a mad rush to whatever had been used for them and us to get to, and it was first come, first served basis. We were running of the potential we would not be able to get authorized to be issued tax-exempt bonds, which either we'd have to issue a different type of bond, which would have a higher cost to it, or we wouldn't be able to provide for student loans. Bad situation, so in this legislative session, we were able to work with Senator Lucio's office and many other stakeholders and be able to get this section, many provisions within 1372 modified. So it gives us the freedom now of up to $200 million limit, but that limit will also increase as the state's overall limit, which the IRS sets, is right now around $3 billion. Our $200 million will increase as that $3 billion increases. It'll increase proportionally, as well as all other issuers. So that keeps us funded, well-funded, into the future, at least foreseeable future, which was the intent. What it also does is, if you all, anybody that's been here more than 10 years will remember that there were some higher education authorities, Brazos and North Texas, and some others, that used to issue federal loans. And TIPI, TG, the old TG, used to back those loans. Well, when the federal government changed the federal loan issuer, made a very limited preferred list, it blocked out many issuers from issuing student loans. Going through this, we modified 1372 and the Education Code to reauthorize Brazos, North Texas, any one of them that want to get back into it can. Whether they will or not, that's going to be independent up to them, to issue student loans. More importantly, what it does is allows them to refinance prior students' loans. So now they can issue tax-exempt bonds, and the students that's graduated 6 years out of school, they're paying a higher rate on a loan from Wells Fargo or Discover. They may be able to find a more favorable rate, just like you would with a mortgage, with one of these lenders. So that's a potential they can get into Coordinating board cannot get into that because the constitutional limits us to students, but also it's not our mission to support students after graduation. We're about access and success. So I thought this was a positive change that allows students in the state of Texas another opportunity. It also allows them to issue parent loans. So that's an item that they'll be able to get into that again, we cannot play in that space that is sometimes needed. Sometimes parents want to fund their students' education. Right now, they may be a co-signer, but now they could actually go out and seek a lower interest rate loan directly. So with that, I'm happy to close, answer any questions. This is the myriad of statute and everything else that we have to abide by in this program. It's a long litany of items, so we are very focused on what goes on behind the curtains in maintaining this program and maintaining the compliance within the program. But with that said, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
What's the current default rate on college access loan?
The current default rate, I think, is around 5%, 4.5%. When you look at the portfolio in general, we have a couple things, and Dr. Poles can tell you, I've been focused on this item. We were down, overall portfolio, we were in the high 3%, which was great, and it came down considerably after the recession. The coordinating board made a change prior to my tenure in this role, made a change to lower the credit standards in the program, and they lowered it considerably, much to my chagrin. And it was, I can't remember the number, maybe 550, 570 of a credit score. And anybody that knows a credit score, 650 is good, the bottom of good. Below that, you're subprime. So we were actually lending to subprime students, co-signers, et cetera, at the time. And we did see our default rate start going up, especially in that pool of people. But it takes time. You have to issue, and then they have to go into repayment, and then time after that. So it took us a couple years to see it. Once we did, we went to the board and we suggested a change. The commissioner didn't want to bring it up quite as high as it was before because we don't want to lock out all students or a certain set of students or parents, but we brought it up to 650. So we've seen a slowdown in that, but we will still anticipate that our default rate overall, especially for those cohorts, will be higher than previous cohorts. So we have seen it go up predominantly because of that reason.
It's still relatively good. I just couldn't remember exactly where it was at, but that would make sense when you saw it increase then.
Yeah. It's good, and we do continue to monitor it because we do need to make sure that we make assumptions when we're setting our interest rate. And after issuing bonds, we have a certain cost, overall interest rate we have to pay on those bonds. So then we set an interest rate for the loans with anticipation of a certain amount of default, right, that you're not going to get money back. And all of the other loans will help cover, et cetera. And we have to keep monitoring that to make sure, like I say, in the future that we maintain the viability of the program, because it's kind of managed on an overall basis, but each loan cohort contributes to the entire portfolio, the over $1 billion that's out there. It's a good question. Thank you.
I have another question, just trying to understand this. So the state receives tax-exempt bonding annually, but who actually seeks the investors, and how often is that done?
Sure. Well, it's similar to your institutions. So we seek the investors. The state gets an allotment, I'll call it, from the IRS, from the federal government, of what all states do, all 50, of what their total ceiling that they can issue for tax-exempt bonds, because the federal government is foregoing tax revenue on investors, the interest that's being paid on this. With that, an investor is willing to take less interest on that bond. So instead of maybe wanting 5%, maybe I'll take 4% because I'm not paying 20% federal tax. So it works out to be about the same, but for us, it's a lower cost. I'm only paying 4% to an investor, not 5%. With that said, we do. So, and especially with the revision in 1372 of the government code, it allows us more flexibility on the timing. Because we used to have to go to August 15th, we had 6 months to go to market. So we determine the investors. We do it by competitive bid. We could do negotiated sale if we wanted to with one particular investor. But typically, the way the market's been, we've done competitive bid. It's been a good higher demand, less supply market, which is what you want for anybody taking economy, that you want to get out there, and when there's more demand, they're willing to take a lower interest rate. So we'll have a competitive bid process. What typically happens is we get a bond resolution from the board, and then we'll go and have rating agencies, S&P, Moody's is who we use, and they'll rate us. We're backed by the state of Texas, which is nice, so that we get AAA rating like the state does. And that helps investors too, because investors will have typically a lower interest rate requirement for better quality of credit. And then we'll work on timing of the market. So we'll look at market conditions. What's the best timing? Typically, I don't want to go to market during Christmas time. Not a lot of demand, right? So when is the demand going to be out there? January, we try to avoid. The problem in the prior years was our 6-month limit from that August 18th was putting us in January and December. 2016, I think our interest rate was a little over 6%, and that was because we hit the Trump bump. So Trump came into office, and there was expectations of a lot of changes. Interest rates went up, market went up, and we had to sell, otherwise we would have no money, and we got stuck in. We paid probably over a percentage increase than we normally would pay. Following year went down substantially, and we've been down lower. Our anticipation will be to try and go to market around June or July. Typically, those are fairly favorable from the municipal bond standpoint. But also, what we were doing in the past is selling a bond, several bonds, $170 million worth, in, say, January, February, literally having to hold on to that money and then start issuing it to your institutions in August and September. So we're sitting on $170 million of debt, and we're paying interest, and yet it's not earning a thing for us to put back into the program. More cost, higher interest rate we need up front to help cover all that. This statute change allows us to make that go away. Now we have the flexibility. We increase the timeline, we increase the project limit, et cetera, so it allows us to have more flexibility on when we want to close. My anticipation is we'll start closing around June and July time period. And we'll go to market, we'll do a competitive bid. Last time, I think we had, out of 12 registered bidders, we had 11 different investors, and they're all the big houses, the Merrill Lynch, the JP Morgans, et cetera. And then we choose the lowest bid. It's pretty simple from that standpoint. It does get a little more difficult if you do a negotiated sale, because it's just what it says. So you go and you start talking to investors, and then you negotiate. And you pick one or two investors and start negotiating what kind of deal you can get. For us, we typically don't do that because we are backed by the state, allows us more flexibility, better demand from an investor standpoint, which is good. The market is very good from a demand, as I mentioned, so we don't need to do the negotiated side. Sometimes that'll generate a higher rate. But if you reflect back to 2008, 2009, when liquidity virtually dried up, almost everybody was having to do negotiated sales because the market just wasn't there. The demand wasn't there. But we set the timing. So myself, my finance team, and working with the loan team on demand, et cetera, we'll set the timing and try and pick what's more favorable for the market. You bet. You bet. And that change will save us around $4 million a year. That interest rate that goes away, you sit on. Imagine getting your mortgage 6 months before you close on the house, right, and start paying for it. It doesn't make sense, but that's what we had to do because there was so much demand for the, in 10 years ago, there wasn't the demand for these tax-exempt bonds, but it increased so much, and mostly on the affordable housing side, which is good for Texas, good for citizens of Texas, but it really constrained us and started locking us potentially out of being able to get funding. That went away with Senate Bill 1474. Any other questions? Thank you. Appreciate it.
I do have a question. Just wondering, how is this loan program promoted to students and families, and what is your perspective on how institutions can promote these programs?
Well, the first item, we do very little promotion from our perspective. We're a state entity. We don't make a profit. We're not a for-profit money-making entity, et cetera. These are all appropriated funds that are in the General Appropriations Act. They're appropriated via rider. So from a marketing standpoint for the state, we'll do some social media when the interest rate changes, et cetera, and more for awareness purposes. I'd say less so from a marketing. We do want students to be advised as best we can from a standpoint of what's the best interest rate, what is the best deal that they can get. Your all's institutions are really the entities that market the program, whether we're on your preferred lenders list, whether it's your students talking to other students, any other, media, social media, whatever you all do, and each institution, I'll tell you, is different. But it's really up to each institution on the program. As you know, there's restrictions on the federal side of what you can and can't do from a marketability standpoint. You can't promote the Cal higher than a federal loan. At one point, I think it was only a few months, our Cal rate would have been lower than the federal rate if you did automated ACH, et cetera. Now, I think the federal rate's around 4.53 or so, and we're at 5.2, so there's a larger disparity. But we typically hover pretty close to the federal rate because we're able to have a lot of cost savings through the initiatives we've performed. But I hope that it kind of answers your question. I can't answer from an institutional. Maybe some of your counterparts here can help answer that. But I know there's a lot of restrictions that guidelines have to be followed to make sure everything's in line.
And I think the restrictions is something we still struggle with,
right?
Because we can't technically promote it, and it could be on our preferred lender list, but it can get washed down in all the myriad of programs, which we can't recommend those either.
Right.
So trying to help direct students and parents to what could be a real obvious good program is real difficult. So.
And it's a slippery slope, as you're mentioning. That I know our commissioner, tries to meet with Department of Education on the federal side each year, and this is one of the items that brings up. This came into play 10 years ago when the federal government, took federal loans private, if you will. We used to issue federal loans, and thank goodness we don't. But there's a lot of requirements behind it. And when they took that private, they put a lot of restrictions on what lenders could or couldn't do in financial aid offices. And that really hampered anybody being able to promote their loan program over a federal loan, which I have to assume was their intent. It does provide opportunity for financial literacy from a student standpoint. A student receiving a preferred lenders list or looking online or what have you, certainly we try to bring awareness, and it's very difficult, to students on, what you're really looking at. Some may take, well, this has less requirements than that one, this one's easier. Yes, but long term you're paying 8% instead of 5%. Is that really in your best interest? Some don't require a TASFA, et cetera, and other requirements. Federal loan, it's more arduous, but you have a lower interest rate, potential for forgiveness in the future if you have certain provisions met, et cetera. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity for financial literacy on a student standpoint. Okay. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you very much. And I do appreciate all of your support with the loan program and the financial aid. You all are key throughout all this. You're the key messengers to the students, et cetera, for what they can and can't get. Maybe, what are the better opportunities given the limitations that you can and can't do. But I certainly appreciate all of what you guys do within that. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the next item, I do want to recognize that Bridget Jans was able to join us. Good morning, Bridget. So onward, discussion, Cal Loan annual and aggregate maximums. Rin Harper.
Good morning. Is this okay? Wanted to give you some information on some research that we've been doing over the past 4 or 5 months regarding annual and aggregate loan limits with respect to our Cal program. As a backup, we currently do not have annual or aggregate limits with the Cal program. The only stipulations that we have is a minimum loan amount of $100 and maximum annual is cost of attendance minus aid. we wanted to look at whether or not the agency needed to implement an aggregate and an annual loan limit. I'll give you some information on the research and the data analysis that we did, but let me at least start the presentation with the agency is not recommending annual or aggregate loan limits. So I don't want to put fear out there. We are not, but want to share with you some of the research that we did, what we found, and then we want to ask feedback from you if in the event in the future we do have to make that decision. We want some input from you. When we started looking at this situation 4 or 5 months ago, we did a number of things research-wise. The first thing that we did is we looked at organizations, nonprofits, state-based agencies, similar to the coordinating board that have private loan programs, to take a look at what are others doing in the marketplace so that we could get a sense of what's out there in the industry. We looked at over 20 agencies that issue private loan funds, and what we found rather quickly is that there really is not an industry standard on aggregate and annual loan limits. Over 60% of the agencies that we looked at do not have limits set. Some that do, they're minimums, very small amounts. From an aggregate standpoint, again, there was not an industry standard with respect to setting those limits. We then wanted to look at, in some detailed analysis of our CAL program, and look at what are the spending patterns of borrowers in the CAL program. We went back to fiscal year 2015 to take a look at, on an annual basis, what was the borrowing patterns of our students. We looked at it from different perspectives, graduate versus undergraduate. We looked at different school types, public, private. What we found over the 5-year period, over 99% of the loans that were made to undergraduate students were for amounts less than $40,000 a year. The large balances really was a very small percentage of students. From a graduate perspective, the percentages were a little bit lower. They were the mid to upper 80s. 1 year it was low 90s. But those percentages, that made sense to us. As we compared that to cost of attendance and the institutions, we did not see that there was excessive borrowing on an annual perspective. We took the FY15 cohort and we then looked at that portfolio over the next 4 years to take a look at aggregate borrowing to see how that pattern changed over a 4-year period. And again, our research was not finding outliers that were excessive. So as we looked at the annual and the aggregate just based on borrowers and what they were spending, we thought, let's take a look at cohort default rates as it's tied to these individuals to see, is there a pattern with borrowing and tying it to cohort default rates. You might have expected that the higher borrowing limits would have a higher default rate. No. Actually, the largest loan amounts actually are for the cohort default rates that are fairly low. Again, we're looking at probably borrowers that have graduated, completed their degree, able to find good paying jobs, and were able to pay the loans back. The default rates really were tied to the lowest borrowing amounts, and typically, as we all know, those are the borrowers that withdraw, they don't graduate. So with all of that, we came to the conclusion that from a risk standpoint, our portfolio is not at risk from not having an aggregate or an annual loan limit. So the decision was made at this point in time, we're not moving forward with that. We're keeping our policy, the minimum loan amount of $100 and an annual amount of cost of attendance less the aid. But if in the future we have to make a decision and implement an annual or an aggregate limit, we don't want to be in a position where we have to hurriedly do something and isn't thought out with you on the campus. So we'd like some feedback from the committee. If in the future, if we had to implement something like this, what lead time, first of all, would you need? How far in advance would we need to establish this and communicate this to you to be able to implement something like this? What type of lead times would you need if we did this?
I don't want to be the only one talking, but okay.
I think the consensus over here is at least a year.
At least a year.
Yes.
And I understand being proactive, but I do want to acknowledge that right now, not having annual and aggregate is very helpful. And from the perspective of parents, or students not have to borrow through multiple programs beyond the federal programs in order to meet their needs, that is very helpful.
Which is really sort of one of the underlying premises of the private program, is to bridge the gap.
Right.
If you have multiple holders and multiple payments, you're going to see defaults increase, you're going to see confusion, you're going to see issues. So definitely, as we looked at this, the last thing that we would want to do, if we can avoid it, is set a limit that would require a student to have to go find yet a third lending partner to fulfill what their needs are.
And then what I could see is if that happens, then some may tilt toward using other alternative loan resources that don't have limits.
Right.
Instead of maybe using the college access loan program, so they don't have to do multiple loans.
And they may pick someone that has higher interest rates, for example, or does not have as favorable of the benefits that we have with the CAL program. So we definitely understand that.
So going back, I think at least a year, because you not only want to update your publications, but you'd want to let current borrowers know that in future there would be limits.
And we would expect that probably it would be an effective date or something would be tied to the beginning of an academic year. I would think you would want us to tie it to something like that, as opposed to, like right now we set interest rates in the May timeframe. I think we would want to tie it to the traditional academic period. Yes.
In terms of the time frame, I agree at least a year, but it depends on, again, what time of the year it is. So for me, most helpful would probably be like April or May, more than a year in advance at the start of the academic year, so we could make sure that students are advised, our websites are updated, and that sort of thing. So, you know, if you tell us in August, it might be a year, but our ability to scramble and make sure that information is available to students who are already looking for the next academic year would be hindered.
So not only would we have to update our materials, our information, but that's an issue on your side as well. You will need to update your websites, your materials, your counseling efforts, your counselors talking to prospective students and current, okay?
We kind of update our collateral pieces in conjunction really with kind of like Apply Texas opening, because when that recruiting season happens. So we could be doing those, you know, very early in the year prior to the July 1 launch of Apply Texas, our coalition, so that the recruiters are taking this information out that has financial aid information in it for that following academic year.
Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you feel like we need to be aware of or to consider if down the road this is something that we have to do?
Can I ask a question? How would you all determine if it's necessary? Like, what would be the factors?
Again, one of the factors that I mentioned that we looked at was cohort default rate, and were there issues with respect to that?
That's ultimately the piece, is we're looking at risk, because, you know, this is a, the goal is to provide students with support and everything, but we also have to take it from a business perspective, that we have to manage the risk. So that really is at its core, is if for some reason something changed in a way that we felt the risk was too high to continue to allow students to borrow at a certain level. So, and as you've heard, and I want to emphasize it just to make sure everybody heard, we're not doing this.
Correct.
We came to a conclusion that it's not necessary. We're just bringing it up proactively to be prepared so that we kind of know, because knowing this idea that we really have to do it a good 15 to 18 months prior to the academic year, that helps us understand when we need to be doing our risk analysis on this piece.
So since the default rate is not really that high at this point, is there any idea of like where it would need
No,
to
we don't have a, like we haven't set if it ever hits 12 or if it ever hits this, because as Ken mentioned in his last discussion, part of what we're looking at right now is that we know our default rate is higher due to a influx of individuals who are at much lower credit levels. And so figuring out how much of that is related to that piece. And so really wanting to see that play out now that we have increased the credit requirement again, if that starts to bring the credit, the default rate down. You know, but if we did an analysis 3 years from now and we did see that, okay, folks that graduate with, you know, who borrowed more than $40,000 a year are twice as likely to default as folks who didn't, well, then that would be a risk piece that we'd need to look at. But as Rin mentioned, so far we haven't seen any of those indicators whatsoever.
And actually, as we looked at the numbers, when you looked at the thousands of borrowers that we analyzed over this period of time, less than 500 actually had loan amounts greater than 40,000. And when you go further up, if you looked at, say, greater than 200,000, could count them on one hand. So it's not large. But getting back to, not part of this presentation, but to supplement what Ken was saying, what Chad was saying about the defaults and about the portfolios that we were talking about with the lower credit scores, we are implementing procedures in our operations to target those individuals more aggressively with outreach and support to assist those individuals so that we can, knowing that there is a higher risk associated with individuals with those lower credit scores, we're going to be placing more emphasis on phone calls and outreach to those individuals to ensure that, and especially those that withdrew versus graduating, so that we can attack those accounts more frequently to assist in not only getting them in repayment, but keeping them in a successful repayment. So looking at our data helps us determine how we use our resources to continue to work towards reducing the default rate.
And I'm going to tweak one of the words because I don't want it to be misinterpreted. We're not looking to do aggressive collections. No. What we're doing is we're going to be doing more proactive efforts to support institutions, because we're not really in the business of collections. We're just trying to do proactive knowledge on those. I just don't want anyone who heard the word aggressive to think that we're suddenly becoming a...
We're not robocalling. We're not doing those types of things. Other comments?
A couple comments on,
yes, sir.
I mean, you talked about the idea of if there were limits, you know, considering would there be different, especially aggregate limits for undergraduate versus graduate versus professional. That would seem reasonable. And then the win, I don't know how much, again, with the limited availability of funds that's discussed, we haven't reached that, but if we were, the idea of implementing something to spread the wealth in a sense would be, I think, another factor as you're looking down the road as to why and when you would do things.
Thank you.
If you're finding that the people with the high limits are really not the default problem, is there something that could be looked at besides that potential setting aggregate limits like GPA requirements or something like that. If the people who are not completing their programs are the ones who are at risk, that would be another suggestion.
And as we looked at the 20 some odd organizations that similar to us that do offer private programs, we saw some of that. We saw some limits tied to GPA or tied to number of hours and progressing to the next grade level and increasing in borrowing for those types of individuals. So there's a number of varieties out there that we certainly could look at as we're trying to determine what would our policy look like.
I would think we wouldn't want to make it too complicated,
No.
but also there are co-signers, so the academic performance of the student is one thing, the ability to pay, and then the onus on the co-signer to pay is another. So, you want to look at that. You also probably would want to take everything that you see now as far as data and maybe extrapolate out, like Ed was talking about, what's that average borrowing at community college versus a public 4-year. And not that you set it right at that average, but looking at some of that data if it got to the point of
Yes, I think we would
having
want to
implement.
do a deeper dive with the different segments
Sure.
to see what we might learn from that. Agree.
I think the other thing you had mentioned, the goal of this is access and not necessarily, lending to those people who are the most least risk. And so I know often the Cal loan becomes the option after the student has exhausted maybe their federal aid eligibility. And I would hate to see that option be lost if we're really working to try to help students who we're trying to help get them graduated.
Right.
Which access and graduation are all the goals of the state. So
Which is our
I would
mission
hope we
and-
don't forget those things
Yes.
in saying, hey, we want to manage our default rate.
No, we agree with that. That supports our mission, 60 by 30 text, yes.
The one thing that we have to acknowledge is we do need to keep the program solvent. And so we can't lend just for the sake of lending to every student if we're not going to be able to collect the money to repay these bonds. We do have that as a mission, but we do have to acknowledge that this is a financial program that does not receive any general appropriations and has to remain self-sufficient. So I don't ever want it to be looked at as it can just be everything to all people, because financially we do have to have a certain amount of people repay, or else the program goes under.
No,
So-
I agree, and I think that's just acknowledging there's a tension there and appropriately making decisions with those tensions that exist, I think is important. Not that I'm advocating we should just be making loans available to anybody regardless of their ability to pay or of their progress towards the degree.
Any other feedback, comments? We appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go back up to item C. Chad, the update on prior FAAC business?
I read the previous minutes, and there's nothing outstanding at this point.
Okay. Then we'll go on to item D, presentation, the co-board chatbot. Erin?
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to share a little bit of information about one of our new projects that we're really excited about. My name is Erin Willig. I'm a program specialist in college readiness and success. And I'm here today to talk to you about our chatbot. Do we have our slides available? No problem. So as you know, the state and the coordinating board are really invested in the success of college advising initiatives in support of the goals of 60 by 30 Texas. And we know that research shows time and time again that effective college advising done at the right time is critical to student success. And the virtual advising project is one piece of that puzzle, we think, and I'm excited to share a little bit about how that project has developed. So, in partnership with the University of Texas at Austin, initially under the Advise Texas program, but now standing on its own, the product that we've developed is called ADVI. It is a chatbot that acts, and I'll show you a demonstration later, that provides, using artificial intelligence, some really basic advising information to students or potential students. And when the chatbot cannot get the answer correct, we have a small team of near-peer advisors at the University of Texas at Austin who can back up the chatbot and provide the information that the student or potential student needs. We initially launched this project this May in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley with a set of stop-out students who were close to a degree but had not yet graduated, going back as far as 2012. We have had some success in reaching those students and having conversations with them about what their barriers were to returning to college, what their interests were in returning to college, and we're continuing to talk with those students via text message using the chatbot and using our team of near-peer advisors to re-engage them in the process and hopefully get them re-enrolled. The next phase of expansion that we're focusing on, using the information that we have about how to scale this kind of initiative, and as you may have seen recently, nudging is in the news, in particular how to scale nudging initiatives. And so we are aware that it works best when it's done regionally and is tied to something that the student recognizes or feels familiar or is connected to their experience. So we are expanding in a regional way, in a very thoughtful way, using on-the-ground partners. So we're developing some partnerships right now. I'll be able to talk more about those in the near future as they become more solid, but right now we're talking with a number of different institutions and entities at the local level, nonprofits and other organizations who support schools, including ESCs, to think about how we can reach students who may need some basic college information, who aren't, they're maybe getting support, maybe they're in high school, maybe they're in between that college and high school in that gap, and maybe they just need some basic information to help them get to the next level, to the next step in talking to someone out of college or re-enrolling. So I want to talk a little bit about why we chose to pursue this initiative before I dig a little bit more into what it is. Two populations that we really want to reach, and we have had we're having a hard time reaching at least some of these folks. The first is Generation Z. So these are the generation that are coming up after the millennials. They're actually similar in size in terms of a generation to the baby boomers, so it's a very large number of potential students that we're talking about. They're currently between ages 4 and 24, so some of them are not quite in the college pipeline yet. But these folks are what we call tech natives. So they have grown up around smartphones, around technology, and for them, integration with technology and responsive technology in particular is not a luxury. They see it as essential. They see it as part of their world. They don't see it as a separate piece. So it's seamless with their lives, and that's why we think something like this that can provide not just a static website or a resource that sits alone on online and they have to find their way through it, but we're really prompting them through it. We're making it personalized. We're coming to them in a proactive way that is more in line with what they're used to experiencing with other tools like, you know, the way that Netflix suggests things that you might like. The chatbot and the use of AI can then suggest things that they might need based on where they are in the process, et cetera. Another population that we are very interested in reaching, and there have been a lot of conversations here at the coordinating board and in our division in particular, are returning students. So students who are coming back to college either to complete a degree that they may have started but never finished, or to upskill based on what they need in their careers. And we know that these people are very busy. They're juggling family, they're juggling other responsibilities, and so we need to provide information to them in a way that is quick and easily digestible. And the beauty of the chatbot and providing some of this information via online chat and text message is that we can make it very quick and digestible. We can walk them through things like the FAFSA. We can walk them through different processes that can trip people up in their way to returning to college. And I won't dwell on this, but I did want to note that there is some research that has come out recently and to continue the conversation about the importance of advising. And we think that this ties right into what we are trying to do with the chatbot, is to really free up students' time and energy to focus on what we know that matters the most in terms of their success in college, which is their academic experience, and on progressing towards graduation. And we can help get them the information they need on some of those more logistical pieces or those process pieces that aren't as fun to navigate and can really complicate people's experiences as they're trying to make it through college. So why a chatbot, you might be asking. I've answered some of that, but I want to just reiterate a couple of points. This enables us to meet students where and when they are ready to engage. So we are reaching out, and we'll have two ways that people can access the chatbot. We are reaching out proactively to some students who we have their information via Apply Texas or via a partner. And so we can text them directly to reach out and ask, what kind of questions do you have about reentering? Where are you in the process? Can we provide you this information? And we can be really proactive in that way. The other way we can use this tool to reach students is for them to opt in. So we can put the chatbot, the widget, on our website, and students can ask a question. In the same way you might be familiar with this kind of technology is, as a customer buying something online, doing online shopping, you often see that little pop-up where it asks you, do you have a question? Do you need support? This is the same idea, but just for college information. We can answer student questions at scale, so rather than having to have an individual available to answer those really basic questions that get asked over and over and over again, we can have the chatbot do that initial level of kind of triage and answer the basic questions, and then our advisors can step in if the conversations become more complicated or require connecting to a specific resource or a specific institution. And again, just to reiterate this point, we can work with populations that have been historically much harder to reach using this technology. So the development of this kind of tool is a little different than some of our normal projects here at the coordinating board, and I wanted to say a bit about the design process. So we've developed some campaigns, and we did this test that I mentioned in the initial campaigns in the Rio Grande Valley and South Texas, and making improvements to the conversations and the knowledge base where the AI draws the answers and answers student questions from. And then we're going to continue to evaluate, and as we do any campaign, we'll get feedback back from the students. We often think about what we can give out to students or potential students, but in this case, it's actually really interesting to think about what we get back in terms of what are the common questions that we see, what are the barriers. We think we know what a lot of the barriers are, but we'll know based on some of these conversations really what are the common questions, and we'll be able to really look at that. And then from there, not only can we then build in more effective answers into the knowledge base so that the chatbot can continue to get better at answering those commonly asked questions, but if we see something that's a really strong pattern or that relates to a specific institution or a specific process, we would like to be able to provide that feedback to you all to say, you know, we hear at this specific institution, there's this specific process that we're getting a lot of questions about, and we can then deliver that feedback back to you to be able to improve and provide a better student experience. So in this way, the tool is going to keep getting smarter and smarter, and it's going to help us continue to get smarter and smarter in terms of understanding student needs. This is just a quick screenshot of one really basic conversation, really simple question that is an example of what ADVI can answer. A student might ask something like, can I drop a class? And I want to note right here that at this point, because this is a state resource, we're not providing information at an institution-specific level. This is at a very basic level that in a way that answers the question in a way that is generalized across many institutions. So you may not see things specific to your process here, but you'll see general information that is generally true, and often the prompt for the student to get in touch with someone on their campus, which may seem intuitive, but for some of these younger generations is something that they may need a prompting to do. I don't know if it's a kind of a common thing that we hear that millennials and the younger generations don't like to pick up the phone, and so whether or not that's true, it's anecdotal and something that we hear a lot about. So we're offering that prompt and often connecting them with that exact link to the office or to the place that they need to reach to kind of help further that along. So you'll see this is a really basic conversation. It prompts them to visit their college's online registration system. If they ask about refunds, it gives them the little warning that, that they may get a refund, but they need to check with their financial aid advisor. Want to point you to our website, which we just recently made some improvements to and have relaunched. And the URL, I realized I meant to put the URL on this slide, but I did not include it, but it's askadvi, ADVI.org. And ADVI is short for advisor, which is something I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. And I'm happy to share that URL and have it be distributed if you all didn't get a chance to catch that down. So we will soon be changing this, but right now you'll see that the online version of the chatbot tool does ask you to log in via Facebook Messenger. This isn't ideal. We're aware that some of the younger generations are not on Facebook, and that is a step, a hurdle in and of itself, and that's something that within the next couple of months we will have taken away that requirement, but right now the system that we're using does require that step. So that's something we're working on and we would like to change. But if you are interested, you can test it out there yourself. So I just want to reiterate just a couple of things before I close and take any questions that you may have. We're very aware and really want to make sure that everyone that hears about this project knows that this is in no way a replacement for in-person advising or the personal relationship that a student has with either an academic advisor or financial aid advisor or any kind of advisor on a campus. What this is one tool among many to help provide the information that we know students need. And it is a triage tool so that your advisors don't have to spend their valuable time having the same basic conversations with students over and over, answering those same simple questions. We can get those simple questions answered out of the way and then free up advisors' time to have the more in-depth and personalized conversations that we know really matter to students. So this is just one tool among many, and we're really excited to see where it goes as we continue to expand this fall. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
I have a question.
Sure.
On one of the slides, it looked like the demonstration was texting like from your phone.
Yes.
So you can just, I could just be standing in line and asking a question and be just like a text.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there are two ways that a student can engage. They can do the online chat, or if we have their access to their phone number or they've opted in via phone number, we can do it via text message. And that's exactly one of the benefits is that, you know, when you have a moment in wherever you are, you can ask those questions.
Sure. Are the advisors available just within a certain time frame? And is that publicized on the chatbot?
So I would need to double check if it's on the website. I believe it is, but the advisors at UT are watching the chatbot from about 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And we're very open to the idea that we might need to expand that window of time, especially later into the evening, because we do see a lot of questions come in later in the evening, as you might expect, particularly with younger students or people who are parents after they put kids to bed, that kind of thing.
And I have one other comment, and this is, you know, that it's so hard for us to get students to understand the difference between the financial aid office and the business office. And when you said when you can get you may get your refund depending on when you drop, and your college policies check with the financial aid office or your advisor. In my office, we don't do the refund, so I wouldn't be able to tell them what that would be. So I think that's just a little misleading as far as being able for the student to know who they need to contact. Because they're gonna call my office and we're gonna say, oh, I'm sorry, you need to talk with the business office or the bursar's office about that.
That's a good point and a change that we can make very easily. We did have some internal staff review those, but particularly the financial aid questions, but there are always things that we can improve, and so that's a very easy change to make, so I'll make note of that.
I recall that each institution was asked to designate individuals to refer specific information to.
Yes.
Maybe explain kind of at what point would that happen, and maybe what's been done or what maybe needs to be done to raise awareness of universities that this has been done, and you might be the person assigned, unbeknownst to you, to get a call about this.
Yes. So we did earlier this year ask institutions to nominate a few contacts in different divisions for our advisors to forward on questions to, or to ask questions themselves to then give back to the students if they reach a point where they don't have the information. So we do have those on file. We haven't actually been using those yet. For the most part, our advisors have been able to answer all of the questions that they need to answer to at this point. But we may get there, especially as we begin to expand the use of the chatbot. Our plan, the UT team that we're working with to develop this tool, they're doing the implementation side. They are working to develop a training, a webinar that we are going to be publicizing to help folks understand what this tool is and how they will be, how they may be contacted to respond to students. So that is in the works, and there will be some communication about that.
So my question is, so this is not a artificial intelligence. This is real people always behind the bot?
It is artificial intelligence, the first round of responses. If the artificial intelligence cannot answer something, then the people step in.
Gotcha. And what site is it on right now?
It's on AskAdvi.
AskAdvi, okay.
.org.
Okay.
We are hoping to, at some point in the near future, implement it on some different sites, particularly the coordinating board sites that have been developed to support students, but we're working out some of the technical details on that piece.
One of the things you mentioned in a previous presentation or meeting or something where I've heard you talk about this was the challenge that chatbots have because they have no memory. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about that so that people can kind of understand the challenges of chatbots?
Yes, so this has been a really interesting learning experience for all of us in terms of how this technology works. And this is another piece that might be familiar if you've tried to engage with a chatbot through online shopping. So if you say, if a student were to come on and say, I'm a student at UT Austin and I have a question about X, the chatbot would then try to answer the question. If they were not to get it right and the student were to ask again but maybe not state their institution the second time around, the chatbot wouldn't know from the previous question that the student had said that they were from UT Austin. So it doesn't hold on to information from your previous chats. You might think it's all part of a larger scheme where it does, but this particular technology at least does not do that. What it does do is in the interface that the humans see, they see that whole text stream. So if and when they step in, if a question develops or confusion develops, they will be able to see the whole conversation stream and put together a much more nuanced response than the AI can develop. But unfortunately, the AI, at least the iteration of the AI that we are using, doesn't have that ability to recognize that previous chat or that 2 weeks ago you asked about something else that might tie into a question that you're asking today. So that is a challenge and it isn't ideal, but we are able to see the full stream for when humans step in to respond. So that's the main way we've been working around that.
What's the marketing plan and holistically and where this will actually live permanently or whatever for students to access it and so forth? Mm-hmm.
The UT Austin team that's doing the implementation is responsible for the marketing, and they have developed a plan. They are going to be doing some social media advertising and some outreach also through traditional media, through things like bus ads and kind of on-the-ground advertising, particularly to reach those returning students and the stopped-out students, because we think that population would be more likely to see it there than perhaps on social media. So that's part of the plan. We're also working with our external relations department to do some earned media and have some conversations with different education outlets about this technology and the way we're using it. And in terms of reaching students, we are also reaching out through, as I mentioned, through the regional expansion. So when we are as we move into a region, we'll be talking with the institutions in that region and some of the college access organizations and the schools and the education service centers in that region to think through what happens locally, how do messages get delivered to students locally, and how can we tap into that, rather than trying to come in from kind of a statewide blanket sort of way. We're really trying to tap into what are the existing networks that are already there and how can we tie into what people are already doing.
I follow up on that. What is is there a possibility for an institution to come to you and say, hey, we would like to put a link on our website? What is that process?
Absolutely. So we would need to get in touch to talk about what you would want that implementation to be. If you would want to just link to the website, that, of course, you're able to do that at any time, to link to the microsite, the askandy.org website. If you are wanting to actually have the chatbot appear on your website, that would be a more complicated conversation about resources and what that might look like, but we can certainly have that conversation. And we're very open to hearing from institutions who might want to get more involved or do more promotion on your campus about this resource. We're very open to that.
And are you the contact that they should reach out to?
I am.
Are the advisors, and Diane, maybe you can, are they particularly in the one-stop shop, or are they spread out throughout campus?
They're not anything to do with my part of the activity. It's only the Apply Texas group.
They are actually in the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement.
Okay.
And they have all received training similar to what our Advise Texas advisors receive. One of them is a former Advise Texas advisor.
Thank you.
Erin, are the questions more related to people just generally looking to go back to school or to start school? Because, you know, the example was about a refund or can I drop a class, and that sounds more like somebody who's already engaged at a school. And so I'm just curious, in terms of the volume that they're seeing, is it people contacting about a specific school? Because it would make more sense to me for them to just contact their school directly versus people who are going through it like an application or a re-entry process.
So at this point, the launch that we did in May in the Valley was focused on a population of students who had an association with an existing college, had been in college before, but were looking to return. And so one of the first questions we asked them was, are you looking to return to your previous institution, or do you have questions about what other institutions you might attend? And from there, we kind of the conversation has different trees that it might follow. So if it immediately goes to they know where they want to go, they want to return to their previous institution, then yes, that's why we asked for those contacts, and that's when we would connect them directly with their institution. I think the majority of the students or potential students who we anticipate using the tool would be in that place of not quite knowing where they want to go yet, not quite knowing where they are. So that you make a good point that the conversation that I demonstrated is much more an example of someone who might already be in school. But the majority of the questions and answers that are in the knowledge base and the conversations that we've developed are more focused on helping people engage in the application and decision-making process before they get there. We are interested in exploring building out more of the knowledge base to support student success for students who are already in school, but that will be another phase as we continue to develop.
Erin, I'm looking at the website right now, and I see that it has the ability to log into Facebook Messenger. Is that purpose to just keep a track of the conversation or keep a record of the conversation since it does not remember a student's profile?
So the tool the vendor that UT chose, their version of the online chat was initially based through Facebook. So that was just the option that we were provided in order to have this online chat. There are some benefits, like you mentioned. It does enable us to then have a record of the conversation in Facebook, and it also allows us to see then who that person is, versus if there's no login. One of the disadvantages of that, even though it's easier, is that we don't then necessarily know who that student is. We can ask them questions about where they are, what level they are at, but we don't necessarily know their name or where they are. So that tie to Facebook is helpful in some ways, but we think that at this point we're thinking it's more of a barrier to have to log in, to have a Facebook account, and there are some ongoing conversations about Facebook, and I think a lot of people have an interest in stepping away from Facebook. So that's why we're going to be moving away from a Facebook-based version of that tool soon.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Erin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we will take a maybe few-minute break. So how about if we reconvene at 11? Okay.
go ahead and start.
Okay. Okay, we are on to item number G, the presentation on TASFA and FAFSA requirements from the 86th legislative session.
Good morning. My name is Claudette Jinks. I'm the Director of College Access in the Division of College Readiness and Success. I was invited today to talk to you guys about some of the legislation that came out regarding the FAFSA and TASFA. Do we have slides? Oh, right here. Oh, there we go. Awesome. Before I delve into the specifics around the FAFSA requirement, I did want to give you a very high-level overview of House Bill 3. There were some things in House Bill 3 that were really relevant to the higher education field, and one of those things was that, one, it creates college, career, and military outcomes bonuses. It also provides funding for the state to pay for one SAT, ACT, or TSIA, and an industry-based certification exam. It also requires that a student complete and submit a FAFSA or TASFA form prior to graduation. I'm going to focus on the graduation piece, but I am going to talk a little bit more about why the outcomes-based funding might be helpful for you to know shortly. So the bill requires that a student complete, just so you all know, the House Bill 3 is a public education finance bill, and it is under the purview of Texas Education Agency. So at this point, we're working closely with them to try to get additional information and collaborate. I don't have a lot of information to share other than what's on their website, which is where they referred me. So what I'm going to share with you is what's been pulled off the website, and I'll refer you to the website as well. What's good about what they have posted is that they have a whole website dedicated to House Bill 3. As many of you know, House Bill 3 is a humongous bill. The biggest piece, if you Google it, is really those teacher salary increases. But the bill does a lot more than that, and I shared with you some of those relevant pieces, especially the requirement for the FAFSA. So it requires that FAFSA or TASFA be completed by graduation. This does not go into effect until 2021-2022 school year. So TEA has deferred a lot of this towards later on down the road. They have a video that's coming out in November 14th. And so they have a lot of other pressing deadlines that they have to meet around the bill. So they will be talking as early as November 14th around the FAFSA requirement. House Bill 3 also, the FAFSA requirement does allow for opt-out of the FAFSA requirement. There are 3 different ways that a student can opt out, either having a parent or a guardian sign a form for them. A counselor can also opt them out under certain circumstances, and a student themselves can opt themselves out if they're over the age of 18. The forms are going to be a local decision, so they create them locally, but the forms do have to be approved by the Texas Education Agency. The section of the FAFSA requirement does establish an advisory board, and so that the advisory board can implement policy of the FAFSA requirement. As I mentioned, there is a lot of different video series to reference the FAFSA requirement. It's not up yet, but there's very limited, like I said, very limited information currently. I already mentioned the November 14th deadline, or the video series that's coming out. I know that in collaboration with TEA, they've already reached out to us to figure out what resources are already available for students so that they can start working collaboratively with our agency to start getting things prepared for that series. I referenced the House Bill 3 video website. Again, everything's broken down there, and like I said, I don't have a lot of information for this piece, but I do want to share with you, before I go into House Bill 2140, that regarding the outcomes-based bonus, the outcomes bonus that comes out, There's funding available from the state under this bill, House Bill 3, that would allow school districts to earn additional bonus money. And there are certain criteria. I don't want to delve deeply into that because that's probably going to bore you. And I couldn't really tell you everything that goes to the methodology in coming up with that. But school districts do receive outcomes bonuses for increasing their student college and career or military ready students. And so they earn anywhere between $2,000 and $5,000 per student that meets a certain threshold. If you want or are interested in all that information, it is in the video. But the reason why I talk about this extra funding is because 55% of that funding could be eligible to for career and college advising, and that includes training counselors on FAFSA, how to do the FAFSA, how to do anything related to FAFSA completion. So there is going to be funding. 55% of those extra money that they earn at the school districts can support training for FAFSA completions. And there's a lot of other things on there as well, like SAT and ACT knowledge, those types of things. There's also funding available for teachers to also have training and for students to prepare for different things like the SAT and ACT. So that 55% of that outcomes-based funding can go directly to those improvements of these college, career, or military-ready students. The remaining 45% can go to local decisions for the districts. One of the examples that I saw on the website that I was referred to is if some of the portion of that money can go to support scholarships for students. They do have on the website some guidance around that, and it does say that potentially they could have additional scholarship funding for this if they meet a three-pronged test. And that three-pronged test is really whether or not this suggestion accomplishes a public purpose, not to benefit a private party. 2, retain sufficient control to ensure public purpose, and 3, the school district receives a benefit for this recommendation. So those are some things that they would have to consider if they want to use those additional 45% of funds for anything like scholarships to students. So know that those things might be happening in your area.
Claudette?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Are you going to head on to 2140 now?
I was planning.
Okay, if I could just stop you for a second on this, just because I have some questions. And I know that you're really looking at the website, and you may not be able to answer this, and I'm also going to look at Kara. I'm just curious, as this gets into implementation, how in the world the ISDs are handling this, and then how are the institutions going to be, how are we involved with
regarding the FAFSA requirement?
Yeah.
I will know that when we reached out to, I can tell you that when we reached out to TEA, that they have said there is an advisory committee that they've established under this bill, and specifically for the FAFSA committee. So if you all want to sit on the committee to have representation at that level to discuss some of these issues, you can. My goal today is to take some of your questions. Like you said, I don't have the answers. We've actually been deferred again to the video because there's not a lot of movement just at this point. But we have heard some concerns from others that there is going to be obviously an influx of FAFSAs coming to your schools. On the one hand, nationally, for some groups, it's exciting, very exciting that because obviously there's that first step is completion for students to know that there are options and funding available for them to go to school. But we know that the funding is not there for every student to go. So we have an understanding of that, but some of those questions that you pose would be helpful to know so that whoever is on the committee would have that information and have to be able to discuss that.
So how would people find out about being part of the committee?
I can share with you, I've been told from a contact there that if you go to, I can send you the link to it. If you go to the House Bill 3, there is a committee. I have a direct link that I can share with Chad, and then we can send that out. Okay. I'm actually nominating myself, so. But,
Okay.
If any one of you all are interested in joining the committee, a lot of when I was filling out the form myself, it is specific to a lot of the secondary, like ESCs or high schools, and some of it you'll just have to say it's not applicable. So just know that as I was working through it.
Okay, before we go on, Kara, can you have some
I can tell you that our district is actually looking at implementing this year. So our district has moved forward with our students in order to participate in graduation ceremonies are required to complete the Apply Texas application and a financial aid application. There will be some opt-outs, and we haven't gotten definitive directive on what will and won't be approved by the district in terms of opting out of that process, but we're moving forward with everything this year.
So for a student to graduate in May of 2020, you're asking them to do that this year? Okay.
And there are several initiatives across the state directly from our division that do promote FAFSA completion. Like we have our Generation Texas activities. Obviously, Texas is a large state, so we don't get everywhere, but we do work closely with our school districts and encouraging them to support FAFSA completions. So like in November, we have a huge month that does two things. It says ask students to complete at least one Apply Texas application and complete a FAFSA or a TASFA. So efforts have already been going, but this requirement has not been in place, so obviously it's going to make things a little bit easier. Like you mentioned, there are opt-out options, so we don't know what that's going to look like. And there are certain things that students might say, we just don't want to do it and sign themselves out of it, which defeats the purpose a little bit, but we'll see what rolls out. Any other questions?
I just wanted to add on to that. One of the things that at the agency we've been looking at is where else this has been occurring. Louisiana is the only state that's already implemented this. Illinois approved a bill about like 2-3 weeks after our bill was approved. So we have looked at Louisiana. Louisiana brought their FAFSA completion rates up to 75% of high school graduates. For them, that was about a 25% increase because they were already pretty low. They're now the highest in the nation in terms of the percent. At the same time, their enrollments went up by about 6%. And their financial aid recipients for their primary grant program went up by 3 to 3.5%. Now Louisiana is a different state than we are, coming from a different place. Their primary program is a merit program as opposed to a need-based program, so there's lots of different factors. But we are starting to try to dig into, if the high school class of 22 has to do this FAFSA requirement, what does that mean for the 22-23 academic year when it comes to enrollments, enrollment projections, when it comes to financial aid projections, et cetera? And no, I don't have any details whatsoever to offer.
Actually, I have worked with several of my school is like a border school, and we're real close to Louisiana. So I've worked with some of the schools in Louisiana, working especially with LELA, their education authority, providing possible speakers and people from the SWASFA region to work with their schools, their high schools, in getting, financial aid professionals to actually go to the high schools and help. And ironically, I'm sitting here and I just got an email from a school that is in my service area, and he said, okay, when are we going to start working on setting up our time for our seniors, which we did this we started this 2 years ago with this particular ISD, where all of the seniors were required to fill out a FAFSA. And so we're already implementing this a lot, right, especially in our little rural East Texas area, where we're trying to get that population of students to understand they can go to school. And so we actually have already implemented a lot of things.
Right. And like you said, we do know of a lot of, I guess, pocket areas where they're very proactive in doing this already, so it should not be an issue for them. However, if you're making it a mandate statewide, there is obviously going to be increases, in which we've tried to do several years, but we're excited to see what the outcomes are going to be with this. I hope you all are familiar that As this bill goes through, and there's going to probably be more interest in tracking these students and knowing that these students are completing their FAFSAs, the Apply Texas Counselor Suite that I oversee as well does have a FAFSA completion piece. There are several components, about 6 or 7 components that a counselor or a user of the Counselor Suite is able to see. So it tracks the student as to whether or not they've completed or started an application, a FAFSA application. That data does come from a different set of data, the U.S. Department of Ed directly, because we have an established memorandum of understanding here with the agency. And so the student's name, first name, last name, date of birth, and whether or not they've started, completed, submitted, and if it's selected for verification are the different components that a counselor can see. So we're anticipating that that usage is going to go up. Know that if you all are working out in the field with any school districts, that we highly recommend you push at any presentations or your staff that the students should select, type in the high school and search and select. That issue has created lots of complications in identifying schools because the schools are matched. The student is matched by school, not by any social security number or anything like that. So we're trying to be very proactive in getting the information out, and we're hoping you all can help that in that area as well, because that is a huge problem in matching those funds, and I anticipate the tracking will be as well if they don't match the school correctly. Are there any other questions before I move on? Okay. The other bill that came out of the legislature was a bill regarding TASFA. As many of you know, TASFA was not in any current legislation, as Chad has told us numerous times. It's not a mandate, and so therefore it was a group of institutions that agreed to do the TASFA, and this is where this lovely form that you all have has been developed. What this legislation is doing is creating the TASFA formally, and it's also putting it online. So some of the things that came out of this bill is that we have now established, are expected to establish an advisory committee of financial personnel like yourself or any other stakeholders that work with students that help complete the TASFA form. Oops. Another thing is that we are to adopt procedures for the TASFA and develop recommendations. So this committee that's going to be convening, that's going to be their task. So they will be convening, and by 2021, I believe, that's my next slide. By January 1st, 2021, the board will report the advisory committee's recommendations, how we should move forward and implement the TASFA form. I want to give you a little quick history. This bill really, in the field, there has been numerous stakeholders that have wanted this TASFA creation, only because you know that there's disparity across the state on how TASFAs are completed. Either they're their own forms, or they have a printout of FAFSA form and other documentation, or they use the TASFA. So a group of stakeholders did push this bill, and they were also wanting to track the information so that they know that a student, because that's student level, there's no student level data for TASFA tracking, and for good reason. But we also know that that's something that's needed, especially as this new bill with House Bill 3 has come up, that they're going to want to know a student has tracked. It's an easier process if there's something that they can see if a student or students in their school districts have completed a TASFA form. So that's where this intent is, where the intent is, and where the stakeholders really wanted this to be. So there were a lot of things that we didn't know when we were pushing, when the bill was going through. And so that's why this advisory committee is in place, is because the suggestion in the bill, or the recommendation in the bill, is to house this information in our current Apply Texas system. And there are a lot of different mechanics and things that we do not know, and how data will filter from one place to another, especially data from, because essentially you're creating a U.S. Department of Ed financial aid piece locally, and there were a lot of unknowns. So the advisory committee is supposed to kind of help with understanding the mechanics of different systems and how they talk to each other, the flow through with the Apply Texas system, and how that data might transfer. We also know that several institutions do have their own TASFA form or their, online TASFA forms already. So maybe if that's more efficient, that might be a recommendation. Currently, the recommendation is to house it on the Apply Texas system, but there might be other recommendations that might not be as costly. So that's where this advisory committee will be a very valuable group to notify and help the potential placement on the Apply Texas system. I do oversee the Apply Texas system as well, and I convene the Apply Texas Advisory Committee. We have, during the process of the legislation, been in discussions with UT to see if it's even possible. And again, they had a lot of unknowns as well, but we are trying to work collaboratively, so they will be at the table during these meetings. Another thing from this House Bill 2140 is that the coordinating board is supposed to be maintaining an online database of the institutions where the TASFA is accepted. There is a current list already available on the College for All Texans website, so that probably just needs to be more marketed a little bit better, but there is a current list that's available. And the other thing out of this bill was that personal information is to remain confidential and not be submitted to disclosure. So with that element, the release of individual student data might be of a challenge, but we'll work with the proper securities to make sure that we have everything in place to meet the recommendation. Okay, I think that's all I have. Are there any questions?
I do actually have something, and then a statement to follow. So my question was, you had indicated the committee would convene in 2021. They're supposed to report in 2021.
Right, 2020, yes, report as of they will have a report done in 2021. So we'll be, the next steps is mainly to find those that we're working internally to find out how we're going to solicit a committee to be on this for the specific purpose.
Okay, so then Chad just pointed out to me that that's actually why the placement of the next item is in there, because that is the TASFA subcommittee, and I think that would allow some conversation on how we might interface with that.
Sure.
Okay. But I don't want to dismiss you. Are there any other questions?
I'll stay here.
Okay.
So
Well,
I do have and I don't know where to interject this, so you may not be the appropriate person, but it was brought to my attention this last week that Senate Bill 232 requires a high school disclosure to their graduates regarding Algebra 2 requirement. And, I hadn't heard anything about this, so Chad, I don't know if you've heard, but supposedly, in that bill, and I read Senate Bill 232, they're not able to receive Texas grant or TEOG funding if they haven't completed it, but they wanted to inform the parents that they didn't have to complete the course, but it could cause them not to be able to get state funding. So that's something that just caught me completely off guard.
I can speak to it, and it is actually becoming confusing for families because we've sent the notification out as a campus, and it's exactly what you stated. It's notifying them that Algebra 2 is not required for graduation technically, but that it's important in terms of progression to college. It's been confusing for our students because we've all just told them that Algebra 2 is required for graduation purposes. So there are very few students or families on our campus where we've even had a conversation about Algebra 2 because it's our natural progression of courses, not just on our campus, but in our district. So I think the notification is actually only creating confusion for our parents more than anything, but it was something that we were required to send.
And I think it's effective for 1920, which I'm assuming, although I don't know if there's going to be regs written on it for our purposes in the financial aid community, but.
Well, in reading the bill right now, the bill is stating that it's simply to provide information on the potential consequences of not completing the course, including any impact on eligibility. So for example, in relation to the Texas grant program, Algebra 2 can be one of the factors that allows you to be considered for the priority model. And so if you don't complete Algebra 2, or a course beyond Al, I forget exactly how it is, because I'm going on the fly at the moment. But it's not that Texas Grant or TEOG requires Algebra 2 in order to get the funding. It's just to make sure that they understand that there may be programs that could be impacted if you didn't, as well as how it impacts the eligibility for automatic college admission. So it didn't create any kind of requirement of these financial aid programs that you have to have Algebra 2. It's simply letting students know, here's the implications of what could occur if you don't apply, if you don't complete that coursework, such as you may not be considered for the priority model for Texas Grants. I have no idea why they listed TEOG, because it has nothing to do with TEOG requirements whatsoever, so I don't know what you're putting in your letter about TEOG.
To be honest, I didn't see the letter go out. I only answered the questions that came from parents as a result of the letter. But we've always just advised students that Algebra 2, in terms of going on and continuing on to college, is a pretty crucial class to begin with. And so it was more just a conversation of, while it is not necessarily a requirement for graduation, it is something we expect our students to take because it's important. So I think the letter just created some confusion because as far as families in our district were concerned, Algebra 2 is a non-negotiable for most of them.
Well, and I understand that there's some association, I don't know if it's high school counselors, but they came up with a draft of a suggested letter to send out. And my concern would be if they're sending that saying that students may not be eligible for financial aid when they really are, then we shouldn't make false statements in letters. If they're eligible for financial aid, we shouldn't be saying they aren't. It's interesting they put that in the legislation. If that's
well, and it's not stating, or the way the thing is written, it's not to tell them that they won't be eligible for aid. It's to tell them about any potential consequences that could occur in not taking the course. So with Texas Grant, very specifically, there is the potential that you're basically cutting off one of the 4 options. You have to do 2 of 4 options in order to be considered eligible through the priority model. And so if you don't do going beyond Algebra 2, then you've cut one of those 4 options out of your potential. So there is a potential for an impact, but as to what this other organization wrote or anything, that would be something I would probably suggest that TASFA look into and connect with this other, because it sounds like one professional association did something that another professional association might be interested in, and so you may want to connect from that standpoint.
I don't
what the
think
group
this
was?
is,
I'm sorry.
I just happened to have received this email from my school district for my son who's a senior, and I didn't really pay much attention to it because he'd had Algebra 2. But looking at it now, it's long and it's detailed, but it is very clear about the 4 options. You must meet 2 of them. It does not mention TEOG. It only mentions Texas Grant. It's referring him to the College for All Texas website for additional questions. It talks about the top 10% requirement at some institutions that, again, may be affected by this. So it appears as though they got it right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is a blanket going out to all students, just maybe
I don't get the impression I've only had a few parents contact me with questions, and I don't get the impression that any of the information was incorrect, or that it was just that they didn't realize that Algebra 2 wasn't a requirement for graduation. That was where they were confused.
Did that email, was that specifically from your school district or, okay. So are you thinking there's another association of high school counselors that came up with a letter that went out? Okay. Okay, I'll talk to you about that.
Can I go back to a question about the TASFA? Your last line on the slide says personal information is confidential and not submit to disclosure. Disclosure to whom?
Let me see if I can word this delicately. Because of the users of the actual TASFA application, there was concern by the author of the bill that there might be disclosure to parties, or the data might be used for other purposes other than its intention. So they included that piece.
Basically, it can't be utilized for anything other than calculating eligibility for financial aid. It's not subject to Public Information Act requests, those types of things.
Correct.
And as Diane mentioned, when I reached out to CRS about kind of presenting on this, talked about having, we have a standing agenda item on our TASFA subcommittee, and wanting to kind of combine the two into a conversation to both hear from CRS your thoughts on how the TASFA subcommittee can be useful, hear from this group as to that, because one of the things want to figure out is, do we need two? Like, if we're going to have a TASFA subcommittee and you're going to have a committee, are we dueling opposing purposes here?
Correct. And,
So-
I definitely welcome, if there's an existing committee, we want to utilize the experience. I will tell you some of the questions when the legislation was coming through was the flow of data, because there are systems in the financial aid that are not the same as, as far as the Applied Texas is concerned, there's different, it's a system, transfers data just like anything else, but they use different vendors that we're fairly familiar with, but we, during this process are not familiar with financial aid vendors that you use to transfer any data. So that was a huge unknown at the time, and as you know, legislation runs very quickly. That's why that was one big task that when we were talking in discussion with UT Applied Texas staff, they didn't have the familiarity to answer that question, if it can be done at a reasonable cost, if the systems can connect, how things would be housed. We know that it's doable because, like they mentioned, UT does have an existing TASFA form, but the data goes directly into their built systems. So they don't have any familiarity with how to transfer. So if you imagine, a student goes on to a TASFA that's housed on the Applied Texas website. They go in, type in their information, and where does it go? How would it transfer to the individual school? That's the unknown.
And I want to jump in here. I think you all are aware UT currently is on our legacy homegrown system, so that is exactly how we're doing it. This is not a PeopleSoft banner or any other kind of vendor product.
Right.
So we are standalone.
But what I wanted to comment on, so Applied Texas right now for all the admissions and scholarship data, it goes into a particular file format that our institutions do have that can load to our system. So it's not, like something that's out there in a gray world. I mean, we have experience with that. So I wanted to get back to Chad's point of, the two committees. I mean, I think we really need to look at that, to work together, possibly, or combined to one committee.
So with that, I can segue into my subcommittee report. And actually, you were looking into an advisory committee of financial aid personnel. The committee that we currently have will be a great addition to that. It will meet your requirement there, because we have representatives from various schools using different softwares. And if we think back in the days of TG, we used to receive one common file that every institution used to load to their FAMs in the financial aid management systems. So we could go back and look into those layouts. Yeah.
And I believe that right, sorry. We will be adding, like I mentioned a while ago, that the Applied Texas staff would be available. So that if that's an opportunity, because the way the legislation reads is and stakeholders. So it's financial aid, which is you all, stakeholders that are, have a voice, that can have a voice even at that other levels, like nonprofit organizations that work with students as well. And then obviously our Applied Texas staff, if they're going to be involved, currently they're supposed to be involved because it says in the statute that, or in the bill, that it's going to be housed on that specific platform. So that's where we would look at that in collaboration with you all. The other thing is that this committee that's in the statute, or the bill, does expire in 2023. So it wouldn't be a disservice to you all to just drop this committee and then go to the other, and then all of a sudden you're back on this other committee. So I think joining forces, to say the least, would be better to join the existing committee and then possibly adding these other stakeholders. I don't know if that's allowable. I'm not familiar with subcommittee work as closely. I know I manage my own committee as well, and I have some questions around subcommittees and how they, if they're only supposed to be existing members or if they can be others. I believe my understanding was that others can be involved, so then that would fit and align very closely with the work that you guys are doing. But like I said, the mechanics of how transfer data would, that's a big question for us. Cost associated with any development, because currently the Applied Texas system is paid by the admissions or the school. I don't know how budgets are at your institutions, but they're paid by every institution, mainly through admissions offices. So the admissions groups are paying for them. That's where it becomes a little bit of a confusion, whether if we look at this as an institution issue and not necessarily just admissions, because if it's an institution and it's almost like you have your FAFSA or your financial aid with the TASFA, and then you have your admissions, what that might look like as far as cost, and if it's coming out of one budget or two budgets, those are discussions I do not know at your institutions. So that's another area of that we would like to explore. Obviously, that trying to develop this, I know that there's already existence like at UT where they can easily just have the components there. So, but the technical pieces is where we really need more assistance, and the costs. So those are the two areas. And there's probably others, but until we convene the committee, I'm not sure exactly where you all focus your committee work on, some of the challenges that you might have, or any information you might have for that.
So our committee's main focus was one, to check with the industry to see if it was needed. And yes, it was the overwhelming majority of schools are using the TASFA. And their reply was, we need something electronic, because it makes it easier to transfer the information to our FAMs, our financial management systems. So, and then the second focus was to update it, make sure it stays current in parallel with the FAFSA, because the question information was similar, and we needed to create a need analysis. So this is where the end result of what was published yesterday. I think it was an email that went out to all financial aid directors yesterday that includes the the English version of the TASFA. One of the recommendations for the committee was to have it to schools available a month before it goes available to students, so that we can have time to either customize it or publish it on our websites, so the students can go and download it from our own institutional websites. So that's why it went out yesterday. But it's not going to be available to students until October 1st in both English and Spanish.
Thing that was something to consider is the data collection. Currently, through the Applied Texas system, the data is housed, at UT, but it also is owned by the coordinating board. So it's here. That's another area of discussion, is where the data goes. So like for UT, when they explain to me in working with them that their data goes directly into their systems, they get to keep it. So I don't know, that's another area of discussion. And there are probably others as we go through this process, but those are the top three issues that we probably need to flesh out a little bit more.
And I just wanted to mention, when this was all kind of going through the legislature, and as Claudette spoke in the hallway, and I spoke in the hallway on a couple things, in my mind, the Financial Aid Advisory Committee itself didn't seem like, we'll just have the Financial Aid Advisory Committee be this advisory committee for the TASFA, since we might not have the right technical, kind of like with the data collection subcommittee, we get people that are really involved in that piece, to provide that advising, as well as the fact that it's, has an end date to it and things like that. But I guess I should ask that of everyone. Is everyone in agreement that the Financial Aid Advisory Committee itself is not necessarily by default the right group to try to help with this, this other committee? I mean, I think it's provide input, but
The TASFA
not for
committee,
us to do it.
The TASFA committee, as you mentioned, Robert, the TASFA committee fits very well with what.
The subcommittee.
Right, the subcommittee,
subcommittee,
yes, not the,
Not, that's, I'm not
Yeah,
talking about
we-
the subcommittee, I'm
right.
talking about,
right, and so the members of, and maybe I misspoke, Chad, what I meant is the TASFA subcommittee.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah, what I was saying was, does anyone think that the FAC should just, we should be talking at the agency of just having the Financial Aid Advisory Committee be the required advisory committee for the TASFA implementation?
No, but I was going to ask
No,
that,
okay.
I'm going to say no, but I wanted to ask the same thing that I asked before, is that the committee, the opportunity to join the committee be widely publicized. I think the TASFA subcommittee is absolutely the primary place, but I do want to make sure that other institutions have an opportunity.
Of course, and like any other committee, I believe they're limited to 24. But we want to start with, since there's an existing knowledge base of the TASFA, we would solicit basically from you and anyone else who's interested, obviously. But there's no intent for the, like you said, all of you all to be the managing that piece. It's mainly the TASFA subcommittee that we're really interested in.
And I think all of us that are part of that subcommittee would be volunteering because we were very excited to be part of this subcommittee.
Right.
And then the TASFA subcommittee can serve as the main conduit to bring information back to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee of what's occurring.
Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds definitely what we were thinking as well. So, any other questions? We are looking forward to working with those of you on the TASFA committee and others. We are going to work with staff to figure out how to start soliciting. So be looking out for that information. Probably a really quick turnaround in the next couple of weeks, probably. So if you have any questions, I didn't provide my information, but Chad has it. And I'll send you all the list of the other FAFSA committee from the Texas Education Agency so that you may, if you're interested in joining that as well, that you can have that reference. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I'm Jarrell Booker. I'm Assistant Commissioner for College Rating Success. One thing I did want to at least mention, and Claudette may have mentioned it in an earlier part, is both bills for FAFSA and TASFA, that report back to the legislature in January or by January 1st, 2021 is important. I don't want to lose sight of why they're bringing you back to the legislature before they make a decision. So as we talk about FAFSA and these things happening, in theory, they don't even have to happen until after the next legislative session. Okay? So I'm just, mind you, they did that for a reason, whether it's a cost involved, whether it's whatever reason involved, there is a report due back for them to probably make a decision at the next legislative session. So I know I recently got the letter from my son's school district and my daughter, and I know like Pflugerville and other districts are doing the FAFSA already, but there is a point to bring it back to the House and the standing committees for a reason. I just think when the group meets, we should be mindful of what's those recommendations and why they want us to bring them back, because there may be a cost and it may be something the group should consider. So I just put that out there.
Just to ask a point of clarification on that, and you might as well stay standing because you're the next presentation too, but because I think there's a nuance that I didn't realize. So the class of 22 FAFSA requirement that was just stated isn't necessarily a done deal depending on the committee, the HB3 committee report that goes back to the next legislature. Is that an accurate statement?
So if nothing changes, it's a done deal. But there's a reason they want it back, a report to them while they're in session. They can change anything they want while they're there. But if they can get the report and say, great, keep moving forward, and there's no bill. But the fact that we have to bring a report back to them during session always makes me leery because anything can happen. So right now, that 2022-23 academic year is in stone. It just could change.
So from a timing standpoint, tying the TASFA automation, the electronic TASFA, to the high school class of 22 graduation requirement, assuming that stands, schools will need to know whether or not their class of 22 students filed a FAFSA or a TASFA. In order to know about the TASFA, we're going to need an electronic system so that they can have that information. That system would need to be in place in October 21 in order to come up at the same time that the FAFSA comes up. But we can't necessarily start building it until after the committee report is given to the legislature. Nobody listening in can hear you, so if you could come up to a mic, that would be great.
It's not clear.
Regarding the TASFA piece, my understanding is the committee, the subcommittee, and whoever else we have for this advisory committee specific to this legislation has to come up with recommendations. So there's no necessarily work according to currently that needs to be happening. If we can get that moving, that'd be great. But it's really reporting recommendations about what we need to do, from my understanding. And so it's discussions, again, of those cost elements, of what needs to be in there, all those, how the data flows, all of those things would be discussed in recommendations on how, because it could be that it's too costly to place it on the Applied Texas system. And then maybe it would be a recommendation that we require every institution, again, just throwing it out there, that every institution develops their own. So that's the understanding I have as far as the report goes. But if there's more movement that we want to make in time, to start going through the process, and we can easily do it, and it wasn't as difficult as we thought it was, I would say let's move and try to align with those timelines. But from my understanding with this 2140, the bill is only asking for us to submit, us meaning the committee, to submit a report, or the board to submit a report on recommendations. So we've actually bought ourselves some time, and that's why the 2023 existent is there, the expiration of the committee, because if their recommendations say, yes, we can move forward on this work, then we have the rest of the time that this committee can convene to implement the work of that. So that's basically what that bill is saying.
So the House Bill 3 requirement of a student to complete a TASFA or a FAFSA will go forward in a paper form until electronic alternative is potentially put into place.
I may misunderstand your question, but I'm just going to say this. FAFSA and TASFA is requirement is going to be in place no matter what. I mean, that's the requirement of House Bill 3. Regardless of how a student submits is not necessarily dictated by House Bill 3 at all. The second piece of legislation, I mean the bill, House Bill 2140, is to start establishing an online TASFA form. So that's a separate piece that if we want to align them, like I said, if there's easier fixes or there's more movement than we thought, then we can automatically start working on that, depending on the timeline. But regardless, the high school requirement is 2122 as a requirement, regardless of the online piece.
That's going to be difficult for students to prove if it's a paper TASFA. How are they going to show that they're going to have to bring the TASFA to the school?
That's why this work is essential, because there's no tracking. Now, a counselor, if I'm working with a student, is going to have to track that. And in the House Bill 3 legislation, it does say that they have to keep those documentation, their own documentation. That's why if we can speed up the timing of creating an online piece, there would be some level of possibly wishful thinking level of tracking.
But it sounds like it's not possible if this advisory committee is only required to have a report, a recommendation, which sounds like actual work is not going to go into place until mid-21 if approved.
I will tell you, we're not going to make the timeline. Yeah. If that's the simplest answer, there's not an opportunity for us, because of all those unknowns that I mentioned earlier, there's not an opportunity for us to establish an online TASFA, unless by some miracle that there's no funding. UT Austin agrees to do this with no charge, which I don't think so, but and no charge, and there's no funding, and then we can just say, okay, it's established, and we automatically figure out the mechanics of the transfer of data to every institution in a few months. Yeah, that is a dream, but I don't think that's a reality. So regardless of this high school requirement, 21-22 requirement for graduation, we would not meet the timeline for that. I mean, there has to be some kind of level of development for the UT Austin staff to have. And not to mention, they're in the middle of a transfer to a new mainframe. So they currently, Applied Texas is currently managing the current Applied Texas in its current format on an existing mainframe and transitioning to a new mainframe. So they're managing two different things. The Applied Texas is expected to start fully on a new mainframe the next year, so next academic school year. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but just so you know, the timing, that's why we gave ourselves enough time, because of implementation and development and implementation of this piece is more lengthy than the time frame of the requirements.
So Kara, you mentioned that you are moving forward. What are your plans at your school district for TASFA?
Currently, we have a form that's already been created that's an opt-out. This isn't direct to TASFA, but for students going military route. For TASFA, we just plan to collect a hard copy of the paper version. And the one concern that we have even about the online, and this is just, looking forward, is that some families are going to be hesitant to submit that data in an electronic format for whatever reason. And so I think it's just going to be some tracking paper-wise. But to be quite honest, we have college and career advisors in each of our 4 campuses, and most of the students, I think, that submit the TASFA actually sit with us to do it. So getting a hard copy isn't challenging for us. In fact, most of the time, I was the one that sent it off for the student. So I don't think that will be a significant challenge in getting a hard copy from the students that complete it that way. But
in the interim, before this online piece really develops, we do anticipate it'll be helpful. But we have heard from the field in secondary groups that it's difficult for a counselor or an advisor to really talk to a student because of all the disparity of how that TASFA is completed. So I know that some stakeholders came to the coordinating board at one point in time to say, okay, how, for every institution, do you have something that says this is how you accept the TASFA, whether it's a hard copy form? To my knowledge, I think we were working on that somewhere along the way, but I don't know if it's ever been developed. But that would be a helpful piece for counselors and advisors to know in the interim until an online TASFA is available. And then, like you mentioned, there might be hesitation even for the student to apply online. Are there other options? Would the form in its hard copy form still exist? So there's still a lot of unknowns that we'd have to explore as well.
There's a very few Texas schools that are using an electronic application for TASFA.
Right.
Yeah. The
I know
majority
there's like
is
maybe
paper.
4 or 5 that I've heard of.
Yeah.
And but yes.
I would be curious to know how many institutions have created their own.
We can get a list for you. I know of a few myself just from discussion, but I know UT, I think, oh gosh, I can't think off the top of my head. But yeah. And there are some that I want to say Brownsville, but I'm not entirely sure, but we can get a list for you.
At the end of the day, I think we'll probably have to seek some additional guidance from the legislature. House Bill 3 requires TEA to have their own advisory committee, as Claudette mentioned, and that they also have that January 1st, 2021 deadline for their report too. So we'll probably have to seek additional guidance, find out if they're in a rush for us to do this or a rush to have a report, and then we can go from there. Should I go right into the?
Yes, please.
I'm also here to talk about Texas Works. This will be very brief, hopefully, based off of questions. Many of you may recall that the state had a bill maybe 2 sessions ago that required institutions to use some of their work-study funds to go off campus. It's my understanding that not every campus was excited about that requirement. So the agency worked with legislators to come up with Texas Works for the agency to actually administer some of those funds for internships off campus. The idea behind Texas Works is we will work closely with TWC to have like an online portal that they already have the Texas Internship Challenge, so we're hoping to piggyback off of that. Advertise internships for companies, obviously separate from your institutions, but companies geographically across the state, where these internships also are required to offer some or demonstrate some form of marketable skills, so we're going to ask that of the employers. And then from that, the funds that we have will help supplement the internship salaries, plus what the private agencies or organizations also provide. Right now, we're developing rules for that. We're hoping our rules will be done sometime, draft rules will be done sometime this month. After it goes through the board process, so it'll probably be later in the fall, winter for that to be complete. Our goal at that point is to be soliciting employers to sign up, and then, of course, early spring, start trying to get students to pick internships to apply for, and then with our first set of interns starting in summer of 2020. Even if it's not a large number, but we do expect to have a number started that year as we work out the kinks and development of the online systems and the paying processes, the marketable skills, as well as identifying enough employers all over the state. We don't want to just be centralized in the major metropolitan areas. We want to be all over the state, so all students have an opportunity to apply for these internships. So that's a quick, brief update for Texas Works. Any questions?
I guess I just want to get clarification on one thing related to Texas Work and the College Work-Study funds from the state of Texas. Correct in understanding that we already have received for FY20 a reduction in our work-study funds to account for funds going here, and yet we do have still the requirement in FY20 to have off-campus jobs documented with the limited funds that we have.
Yes, the way they wrote the legislation, instead of enacting on September 1st, they have a sentence in there that this particular piece doesn't take effect until summer of 2020. So yes, there is this awkward overlap that has occurred.
That was not by design. This, and just a little bit of legislative history, it passed, I think, at 11:58. So I don't think everything that was intended actually made it in, but it is a little awkward.
It was the last bill to pass.
That's correct.
And so, I mean, no way to fix that, to alleviate the need for schools to, in this year, meet that off-campus requirement with our work-study funds.
There's no way for us to issue a rule stating that it's not required that you do this.
So if we were audited, it could be an issue in FY20.
If our compliance area chose to select that aspect of the work study, and your institution happened to be an institution that they selected to look at that, then in theory, yes, it could. I have not heard any discussion in the agency of the off-campus work study being a core compliance risk concern.
I haven't heard it either.
Okay.
Which is probably why we have Texas Works. Good question. Any others?
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Okay, on to item J, presentation on peace officer loan repayment. Lisa?
Well, it's almost good afternoon. Before I focus on the new Peace Officer Loan Repayment Assistance Program, I'd like to give you an overview of the active loan repayment programs administered by the Coordinating Board. Although there are other loan repayment programs authorized in statute, some of them haven't received appropriations in quite some time. So I need to do this. Anybody want to show me how to do this? There we go. Okay. So this slide provides a snapshot of the 6 currently funded loan repayment programs, including when they were authorized, appropriations for the current biennium, maximum annual and aggregate award amounts, number of years allowed for participation in the program, and the number of current participants. And I see my update to this slide didn't make it in. There are actually 405 physicians participating in the Physician Education Loan Repayment Program. The acronyms stand for the statutory names, which in some cases are Loan Repayment Program and others are Loan Repayment Assistance Program. Very quickly, I'd like to summarize these programs. The oldest program is the Physician Education Loan Repayment Program, or the PELRP, authorized in 1985, and we believe this was the first state loan repayment program of its kind in the country at the time. The primary purpose of the program is to recruit and retain physicians in federally designated health professional shortage areas. This program has the advantage of a dedicated source of revenue from sales of smokeless tobacco. And although the funds must be appropriated by the legislature, the reliable source of funding provides a level of confidence in continued funding for future biennia. The PELRP maximum annual award amounts increase with each year of service, and physicians enrolled in the program before September 1 of 2019 can qualify for up to $160,000 over a period of 4 years, while those enrolling after September 1 can qualify for up to $180,000 over a period of 4 years, and that's due to a statutory change made in the most recent session. To qualify for the Teach for Texas Loan Repayment Assistance Program, teachers must be teaching a shortage subject or in a shortage community as designated by the Texas Education Agency. This program has been oversubscribed nearly every year since its inception. The award amount is determined by the commissioner based on available funding and the principle of helping as many teachers as possible. That amount has been $2,500 for a number of years. For the Math and Science Scholars Loan Repayment Program, qualifying math and science teachers must have completed an undergraduate or graduate program in mathematics or science. The statute was amended during the most recent session to change the minimum GPA requirement at graduation from 3.5 to 3.0, and we believe that's likely to lead to an increase in the number of qualifying applicants. Teachers must agree to at least 4 years of service at a Title I school in Texas and may qualify for up to 4 additional years of loan repayment by teaching at any Texas public school. Nursing program faculty at any Texas public institution may qualify for loan repayment through the nursing faculty loan repayment program. 7 types of mental health professionals may qualify for loan repayment through the loan repayment program for mental health professionals based on service provided in mental health professional shortage areas or certain correctional facilities. Annual and aggregate maximum award amounts vary based on type of professional and year of service in the program, so the amount increases each year. Finally, the newest loan repayment program for peace officers provides up to $20,000 in student loan repayment for qualifying peace officers over a period of 5 years. So the terms loan repayment and loan forgiveness are often interchanged in discussions about workforce incentive programs. Our definition of a loan forgiveness program is one that requires a promissory note that includes forgiveness provisions. If specified conditions are met, or are not met, such as required service, the loan must be repaid according to the stated terms. Of course, if they are met, the loans are forgiven. The Coordinating Board does have experience with such programs. For example, the no longer funded 2 conditional grant programs for teachers involving loans with forgiveness provisions 59% of the recipients in each program had all of their loans forgiven. This means that 41% of recipients did not serve the primary purpose of the funds appropriated from general revenue. Additionally, the administrative costs of servicing and collecting the loans must be absorbed by the coordinating board. One of these programs has a 10% default rate and the other has a 13% default rate. And for the Be On Time loan program, we'll soon calculate the forgiveness and default rates for FY 2019. For FY 2018, the statewide average 3-year cohort forgiveness rate was 43%, and the statewide average default rate was 24%. So this slide highlights the advantages to the coordinating board's loan repayment program model. Each annual award is disbursed to the participant's lender after a year of service has been provided. And for all of the reasons highlighted in this slide, we advocate for this type of model for new programs when we have the opportunity. The bill that authorized the Peace Officer Loan Repayment Assistance Program, or Loan Repayment Program, was Senate Bill 16, and it received very strong support from the legislature. It was one of the Lieutenant Governor's priority bills. It received almost a unanimous vote in favor, and it received a generous appropriation from general revenue. Draft rules were published in the Texas Register on July 26 and will be considered at the September meeting of the board's Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning. The definition of the term peace officer includes 35 distinct groups. The Texas Commission for Law Enforcement website recently reported a count of over 78,000 licensed peace officers in Texas, ranging from game wardens to urban police departments. We did convey to legislative staff that priority would be given to eligible applicants on a first-come, first-served basis, and this is reflected in the draft rules. As you can see, to qualify, a peace officer must initially be employed as a peace officer on or after September 1 of 2019, must have earned at least 60 semester credit hours or the equivalent at a public or private institution of higher education, which we pointed out to legislative staff we interpret as being a Texas institution, before the person's initial employment as a peace officer, must be currently employed and have completed at least 1 year of employment as a full-time peace officer in Texas. And the loans must have been for attendance at a Texas institution for a semester or term that ended in the 5 years immediately preceding the person's initial employment as a peace officer. So the earliest possible date to submit an application would be September 1 of 2020. The statute reflects an intent to recruit recent college attendees, not necessarily certificate or degree holders, and the loans for attendance at out-of-state institutions are not eligible for repayment. So once the rules are final, we will create a program webpage with a link to the rules. The project to add an online application process is being considered at the agency's Information Technology Steering Committee today. In fact,
It was approved.
Oh, yay. Good. So we know there's a lot of interest in this program, but at this early stage, it's difficult to predict how many, the number of eligible peace officers that will be applying next year. So we have a lot to learn. So for information on all of our loan repayment programs, the web pages are housed at hhloans.com, and you just select the loan repayment programs tab, and I've included the contact information for Stacy Johnson, who is the program manager for all the loan repayment programs, and she's the person to contact with specific questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Do you have the usage information on the peace officers loan repayment assistance, particularly like over the course of the years? Oh, here it is.
Peace officer is the new one.
Sorry, that's the new one. I'm sorry. I found what I needed.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Anything else? Okay. Thank you, Lisa. On to the next agenda item, K, update slate of nominees to be presented. Chad?
In your packets is the slate of nominees that's going to go to the Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning for approval later this month. We got a very large group of applicants. One of the things I want to emphasize is that for anyone who was nominated who wasn't selected, it wasn't for lack of being a great candidate. We didn't get any applications from anyone that wouldn't be a great person to have. What our focus is trying to make sure that there's representation across the sectors, geographic representation, rotating opportunities, so that new institutions have the opportunity to participate that haven't been able to participate before. So it is a difficult selection process because we do get so many applicants or so many nominations. But wanted just to let you know who the individuals would be. They will be approved at the end of, ideally, they'll be approved by the board at the end of October so that they can attend the November 21st committee meeting. So. Any questions?
Okay, hearing none, we will move on. The Data Collection Subcommittee, Samantha?
The subcommittee met on June 12th, as I reported when we met in June. They did have a chance to test the new grant request system that has gone live on August 1st. They put us in a computer room and we got to play with it, and I think we found a few bugs. We also talked about discussing what FADS 1920 open and ending dates on the 3 cycles would look like. At that time, it was June, so we were just starting our 2nd cycle. So we have, through email, now over the summer, come up with some proposed dates that we'll hope to be ready to go for the 1920, which the first cycle, if you remember, starts sometime in February. We do plan to have another meeting this fall semester, where we'll look at some of the edits. 1920 is basically done, but maybe looking forward to 2021 with any edits that might come from summer grants or from other things we've noticed through the FADS. And then probably finalize those start and end dates for the cycles for 1920.
Any questions for Samantha? Thank you.
Deshay, do you have any update for us on the payments portion of the project?
Yes. Is it afternoon? It is. Good afternoon. I wanted to quickly just give you a quick snapshot. Like Samantha mentioned, we did go live on August 1st with the grant payment system that allows the institutions to be able to request as well as return grant funds. As of today, we have received 22 requests that topple over $46 million. And so we're in the process of getting ready to start paying that out to the institutions. So it seems as though the process so far has been working. I know there have been a couple of questions that have come through from some individuals who are trying to log into the site. And so we welcome any feedback as we can continue to enhance that system. So if there's any additional feedback as you're navigating, or as those individuals at your institutions who have access to it navigate, definitely send that information off to me. So I'm very excited about that project going live, and again, we'll continue to make enhancements as we see fit. I did want to add on about the financial aid database for 18-19 cycle 2. As of yesterday, we still had 57 institutions who had yet to validate their file, and cycle 3 will begin on September 30th. And so we have been proactively working with those institutions. We do know that there had been some slow processing on our end that has been updated, and so those files are going through as they normally should be going through. But encourage your colleagues to finish up, because it does hold up any future disbursements that they need for 2020 until we can get that reporting done.
Okay, onward. Presentation on the proposed rules. Chad?
In your handout is a sheet that has all of the rules that recently had their 30-day comment periods close, that closed on August 26th. Several of them we had already reviewed in a previous meeting. We'd already talked about the tuition equalization grant in a previous meeting. A couple of the others, I just want to give you some specific, to refresh your mind on what they are. The first one, the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee, we're just finally repealing that committee because it doesn't exist anymore. On the Hinson-Hazelwood program, actually throughout many of these, we're removing a lot of redundancies. We're in the midst of a 4-year review process that we do. Every 4 years, we review all of our rules to try to identify whether there's any updates that need to occur, et cetera. And so a lot of the changes are to take out things that are mentioned both in the general provisions and in the rule itself, so that we can not have the duplication and run the risk of having things misaligned. So we have a lot of that. We're also getting rid of a bunch of rules that no longer are no longer necessary. With the Hinson-Hazelwood program, in addition to removing the redundancies, we also aligned the language with the statutory update so that it specifically reflects how the eligibility is determined, so that it now indicates that it's the difference between the cost of attendance and the financial resources available to the applicant, including the applicant's scholarships, gifts, grants, and other financial aid. Before, it had comments about, it had wording in it about, in the statute, about family resources and things like that, and that's been cleared up in the legislation. So it just makes it clearer that it is cost of attendance minus financial aid. I also mentioned, I believe in the last time, that we're in the midst of repealing the rule surrounding academic transcript holds. So the Cal one is going to this set of board meetings. The BOT and TASFA repeals will be in those, but we will no longer be expecting institutions to place academic holds on students who are delinquent in their payments. We decided that that was more of a barrier to someone's completion than it was, or the negative of the barrier to someone's completion was greater than any kind of benefit we were receiving from trying to improve collection and payments. And so we are removing that academic transcript hold requirement. In terms of the Hinson-Hazelwood loans from before fall semester 71, we just removed a whole bunch of pieces that don't make any sense now that we're not issuing loans on that program. Top 10%, we repealed the rules since that program has been phased out. The physician education loan repayment program, we updated the statutory, or the maximum that's allowed in statutory. And then we repealed some loan repayment assistance programs that have been unfunded for 2 biennium. I did want to mention 2 programs that did receive comments on them. One was one of the repeals on the dental education loan repayment program. There was concern about repealing it, given that it still exists in statute, and that is the, when we have something that's unfunded for a couple biennium, we remove the rule, but it has no impact whatsoever on the fact that this program does exist in statute. And if it's funded, it absolutely will occur. The other one that we received some comments on was in the general provisions. and wanted to just give you a preview of what we've mentioned for the Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning. We received a comment from both Texas State University and Texas Tech University in opposition to the prescriptive timing of the GPA calculations required, because it was stating when the calculation for GPA needed to occur. The response that we're providing to the CAP is that the staff agree with the comment, and that 22.10b adds an unnecessary complication to the SAP calculations and will be removed from the final rule. Texas State also commented in opposition to the addition of a definition of an academic year in conjunction with the GPA calculation, and staff agree with the comment that the addition of that particular definition adds unnecessary complication to the general provisions, and that definition will be removed from the final rule. In both those cases, we realized that when we went back and reread the satisfactory academic progress requirements that are in each of the programs, those definitions that already exist, or those rules that exist for the satisfactory academic progress, effectively covered everything we were trying to achieve. So we didn't need to duplicate it with additional items in the general provisions. And then Texas Tech University commented about all attempted hours should be included. The staff didn't agree with that in terms of the change, but that was because the provision looks at all earned grades. So attempted would look at things like an incomplete or a withdrawn, which are attempted, whereas GPA and satisfactory academic progress calculations are looking, or the GPA calculations are looking at earned grades, not attempted hours. So we didn't make any change in relation to that one. So wanted you to be aware of the comments that we received and our response to those comments in case there was any additional, or whether there was any feedback you wanted to provide me. Sorry, I am just not speaking well today. I apologize. So any questions or comments on those? Okay.
Okay, moving on. This next one is actually my line item. This is establishing a subcommittee to develop legislative I'm sorry, what did I miss?
I just did
pointing
M,
out.
now I need to do N.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just pushing right along. Okay, and
So what I just covered were proposed rules whose comment periods have closed and are going to go to committee for approval, the CAP for approval. Next, I wanted to mention updates that are going to be proposed this fall for a 30-day comment period for approval at the, ideally approval at the December Committee on Affordability, Accountability, and Planning. We'll be taking several items that we've identified. There'll be some updates to the Be on Time program, but those I mentioned are going to be removing the academic hold piece that we already did with the college access loan. And there's also some updates to the the old conditional grant programs that existed for the Teach for Texas program. We don't issue conditional grants through that program anymore, so we are proposing getting rid of all the rules related to issuing new loans through that program, so that the only rules that would remain are those that are related to the actual collecting of the payments on that program. We're also looking at updating the TASP program. One piece we're looking at is the academic holds removal piece. The other thing is we're looking at the potential right now. It does not provide any provision for a student who's in a 5-year degree program. Currently, it limits it to 4 years of the 6 years allowed for graduation in the program. And we're looking at the potential of allowing it for 5 years for a student who's in an approved program of more than 4 years, typically engineering programs. So we're looking at that potential. The one specifically that I sent out in advance to you all is we're looking to make changes to the TEOG program. We are looking to make modifications similar to what I brought to you last meeting, where I brought you a very large rewrite of the TEG program. This is a very large rewrite of the TEOG rules. The goal in the rewrite is, one part of it is to try to bring our rules in greater alignment. So as you look between our different programs, it's easier to find things. For example, in some of our rules, satisfactory academic progress is its own rule for the program. In other places, you have to figure out which rule has the satisfactory academic progress. So you have to know that within eligible students, it has satisfactory academic progress in there. So trying to bring consistency to all of our programs. Trying to get rid of redundant information or provide clarity to reference people to the right information, reference to the right other rules that they might have to look at. Getting rid of things that are already in the general provisions. There's a whole set of definitions that are in the general provisions so that they don't need to be repeated in the individual rules themselves. As well as trying to get information in to make sure that everything's clear about for summer, like there were some references to in some of the programs, there were references specifically to fall and spring. And so we need to get those references out so that it's possible to make the awards during the summer as well. I don't believe, and I'm looking real quickly, nothing in this rewrite was intended to really make any change to the way TEOG is operated. It's more to make it clear, to give the right references, to make it easier to find information. For example, in TEOG, there's priorities for funding, but the priorities were in different places throughout the rules. You kind of had to hunt and peck for the different priorities. So we pulled all the priorities into one place, but the priorities themselves aren't changing. It's just the location is changing. I'm just checking. So yes, so nothing within the TEOG rewrite was intended to change the intent of what we're doing with the program. It was just meant to provide greater clarity during this 4-year review process and to remove and repeal unnecessary information. For those of you from 2-year institutions, was there anything in what we're proposing that caused you any concern in what we're looking to do?
No, we didn't have any.
No, sir, we didn't.
Great. That was actually my hope, was that I hadn't done anything that was going to raise any eyebrows, because that wasn't the goal of this rewrite. It was just to help bring more structure and clarity to ours. So this will go out along with several others for 30-day comment periods this fall in order to go to the December meeting. When they go out for comment, we will send a notice out to the TASFA listserv as well as to the internal listserv that we maintain to try to make sure as many people are aware that the opportunity exists to comment in case there's something else you notice. Thank you very much.
So item O was one that I had suggested. We had done this Delisa, I believe, with you for the last prep in last session, but it's something that I felt very strongly that we would need to do again and wanted to give sufficient lead time. We did just finish the session, but 2 years comes really quickly. So just keeping this concept going, I wanted to propose that we adopt a similar structure and have the committee vote on whether or not you think that's a good idea. We can, if that's the case, I think what we would do at this point is you can volunteer currently, but I'd also like to throw it out to the advisory committee members to think about it and then let me know if they want to join later on. This doesn't, we don't have to make a decision on every single member right now. Discussion? Looks like it's a go. Okay.
This is one that you would want to. This is one where you would want to move that you're going to create this and take a vote.
Right, and that's what I was looking for. Do I have a motion? So, second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Anybody willing to volunteer right now?
I will, Diane.
Great. Shannon? Anyone else? Okay.
I'll work with Shannon.
Awesome.
Oh, the subcommittees are open to anyone. Yep, subcommittees
I'll be
are
on
open
that
to
committee.
Perfect.
We would need a chair in order to, the chair does need to be a member of the committee who can report up to the FAC chair about all activities.
Okay. Shannon, would you be willing to chair? Okay, so Shannon will be the chair, and I'll volunteer as well. Okay, and if anybody else wants to join, just let me know after the meeting. Okay, thank you. Okay.
And as I mentioned, it is open to everyone, so the current members can reach out to help ensure that there's representation across sectors and geography, et cetera.
Great. Okay, item P.
Okay. So as Diane mentioned, the legislative, it seems like it's far away, but it's right around the corner as to when we're going to start putting together thoughts for the next legislative session. And I'm going to reiterate what I wrote at the top of the handout for this. The following ideas have been assembled based on prior FAC discussions, financial aid studies, recommendations from higher education organizations, and a general review of state financial aid statute. They do not reflect specific recommendations of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and are provided simply as a tool to encourage discussion and idea generation. So if anyone's listening online or anyone goes back to their organizations and states, the coordinating board is going to do X, I have this video that I will be able to send to your boss, your president, whomever, to state, no, the coordinating board never stated that this is something we're pursuing. These are just to get the conversation started and help us know whether or not ideas are even worth pursuing, whether there's things that the subcommittee might want to pursue as they look at it, et cetera. One of the things that I have put together more detail on than the others is the priority financial aid deadline, because it's something that has been a discussion piece ever since we've had the discussion about your all thoughts on why so few transfer students receive Texas grant funding. And we got talking about, with Texas grant and the timing of when transfer students are admitted and when their whole application process is, and how the fact that the whole process occurs later and occurs after the financial aid priority deadline, significantly after the financial aid priority deadline. So it started to kind of question of, could the financial aid priority deadline be one of the contributing factors to transfer students not receiving Texas grant? But as I read more about financial aid studies and things like that, one of the things that I saw, particularly in a piece by the Education Commission of the states, they have a redesigning state financial aid document that they put out, and it talks about how time-based approaches, such as financial aid deadlines or FAFSA deadlines, could have unintended negative consequences for students, such as punishing students who have less access to information about financial aid, that it could dilute strategic funding priorities. So for example, compromising the ability to target state dollars, specifically as we talked about with the priority model, which takes precedence, the priority model or the priority deadline? And if it's the priority deadline, does that dilute the impact of the priority model if that's a piece that we're trying to push? The time-based approach very often aligns with traditional enrollment patterns, e.g. applying in the fall of your senior year to attend the following fall, and thus time-based approaches may restrict the flexibility in allowing for non-traditional application and enrollment patterns, such as alternate enrollment cycles, starting at different times during the year, application cycles. Decisions are often made in the 2 to 3 months leading up to the start of a fall semester at two-year institutions, at non-selective institutions and the like. And one of the pieces with the state's completion goal is that it relies on direct from high school enrollment as well as transfer enrollment and returning student enrollment. We have grad techs is one of the particular programs that we have to encourage students who have completed a significant number of credits but haven't finished to go back and finish. And so it raises a question of, does the state priority deadline impact a school's flexibility to target funds towards all these populations? Does it impact the non-time-based eligibility criteria, such as the priority deadline? Could it potentially contribute to the confusion that exists when students are involved in application cycles of more than one educational sector? So as I saw all these different pieces, and I included in the handout the actual statute and the actual rule, when I saw all these different pieces, I thought it would be good to come to you as a group to get your feedback on whether you think this is a piece that the coordinating board should continue investigating the impact of the priority deadline, or whether it's a piece that you all feel that don't even look in that area, that's not an area that concerns us whatsoever. We think it benefits the students and shouldn't be up for debate whatsoever. I'm just trying to get a feel for what the schools think about the priority deadline in relation to its impact on students specifically.
On the priority deadline, we end up spending a lot of time trying to let students know it's a priority, it's not an end date. So I would be in favor of revisiting that.
And my institution is in kind of a different situation where we have so many students who are completing by the priority deadline that we are desperately trying to stretch our funds. For us, it pretty much is a drop dead date in order to qualify for Texas grant.
I would, a couple thoughts, certainly agree with this concept of priority dates, deadlines are set on an assumption of a traditional enrollment pattern, a traditional student, and that isn't the world we live in anymore. And so how to get around that, I think that's true in many areas of what we do. The other is, I think, you know, I think the priority dates serve primarily as a rationing tool because we have limited resources, you know, as mentioned there. And so, you know, if we can't get past the idea of we have limited resources and we need to find a fair and equitable way to distribute those resources, and being first in line is still a concept that appears to be a fair and equitable way to disperse or make aid available, then, you know, I don't know how we can get away from a priority date. Now, that can be solved by either there are other fair and equitable ways to do it and change the concept, or have funds available that are sufficient enough to help the needs of all students and not just those who do things according to either a timeline that we've set because we think it's the timeline it should be versus what the student believes their timeline needs to be, should be, where they're at. Or, you know, a recognition of just, again, how education is delivered is significantly different. But I think so many of the things that we do with our financial aid applications, with our dates and everything, are no longer, I guess now I'm getting on my soapbox, so I will do that and then I'll get off real quick, are no longer a fair and equitable system to distribute aid, but are systems that are implemented in order to ration limited resources. And, you know, that's a discussion maybe for another day, but I'd like to get back to a world where we could talk about what's fair and equitable in distributing aid and determining what a family's financial need is versus one that's just saying, how do we create systems to ration the limited resources that we have.
I've looked at the priority deadline a little bit more in the sense of to try to help encourage students to get their applications in, because if they're selected for verification and the timing for them to get documents and all of that, it may be worth looking at, you know, some data over the course of a couple years when it was March 15th versus now being earlier. And does it look any different in terms of number of students receiving the funding, like from transfer population now to previous, you know? One of the things, you know, a lot of our students are admitted really late as transfer students. So that's the hard thing too, because we're funding all these other students up front. And so if you don't have funding left over at that point, but I'm just wondering if moving the date really made a difference or didn't in any kind of way in examining data. Would that give us a clue at all? I mean, in my publications, I actually use like a December date, December 15th, and particularly it's to encourage our students to get their FAFSAs in as early as possible, so that, you know, we can get their files completed, specifically freshmen, because we started awarding fairly early. So the more that we can get filed at that point in time and get files complete, then the more that can get a package early so they can kind of know what eligibility would be at the institution.
Any other comments?
And I mean, and of course, I was vocal on this when we talked about it before, but transfer students are one issue. I think that also across our state, there's such a diversity of the kinds of students that we're serving. So speaking to the fact that an uneducated consumer may not realize they missed out on it. So that would be a reason for removing the deadline, however, or the date. However, that date is important to let somebody know at least some kind of guiding guidelines for when they should apply. And I think that that's important. But as far as for the coordinating board to like have a regulation that stipulates what that date should be and can move it, you know, from March to January, like that might not be as beneficial to each individual institution based on their population or how they spend the money. So that would be a factor to eliminate that date. So I see both sides of that, and I certainly think that it bears investigation and maybe looking at some of that data compared to now from a couple of years ago. So I would be in favor of that being on the radar.
Do any schools run into situations where their funding doesn't even allow them to fund everyone that does apply by the priority date? That they end up with an even earlier cutoff because they've just run out of money?
We run out.
Okay, so you have priority deadline people that
Yeah,
they
we
file
help.
by the priority, but you don't have enough money to fund them.
Correct. And so we end up with what we're considering a wait list, and we move through that as we get rescinds on admit decisions.
So it's
we've
also
we've
not
had-
a guarantee of funding in
It
any
is
way.
not. We've had a significant wait list for the last couple of years. We've had 600-plus students.
And Chad, I'm worried that we're approaching that point too.
So weighing that potential of false expectation of that date. Well, then it sounds like you don't think that it's a dumb idea for me to keep looking at this, so I'll keep looking at that and keep seeking feedback. Another piece that we're looking at diving into is, to what extent can we align state aid requirements with federal requirements? Are there places where it would create efficiencies, transparency, et cetera, things like potentially the selective service requirements, the controlled substance requirements, the satisfactory academic progress requirements, places where the state and the federal government have two different definitions of the same thing. Those were the three that I could come up with as I read through things and looked through things with selective service, controlled substance, and SAP. Are there any others that run through your head all the time of why does the state do this differently than the feds do it?
I can't think of it right off the top of my head, but I will ask my staff. But the thing I want to say is amen.
So, well, I'm just looking at it. These are no guarantees, just looking at it. So, but please do ask your staff and email me if there are other pieces where the definitions of the same thing. Now, Texas grant eligibility is never going to be the same as Pell Grant eligibility. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at things where it's just kind of the same requirement, but we define it different ways.
And also, to that point, it's a little bit different, I guess, but the selective service is maybe it is different, how the state treats it versus the federal government.
Right, yes. So that's definitely on the list of things to look at. Another piece I'm looking at is, as I've been trying to compile all of the different ideas that have come in through all the different avenues, thinking about who are the populations that aren't served by any of our programs. That these students, none of the grant programs would they be able to access. The example I use all the time is a student enrolled at a baccalaureate program at a 2-year institution can't get any of our grant programs. The only program that 2-year institutions can do at this point is TEOG, and the TEOG statute specifically requires that you be enrolled in an associate or certificate. So those students don't have access. Students who don't receive a state grant in their first year of eligibility there's challenges to them being able to get that state grant. Now, if you don't get TEOG in your first year of eligibility, you complete an associate's degree, you can go transfer to a 4-year, you can then get a Texas grant in theory if you're selected. But I'm talking more, if you miss out in the first year, can you get it in subsequent years? TEG actually has more flexibility on that than some of the other programs, but that's a group. Students who are returning to public institutions after time away, someone that's been gone, they've been gone for several years, they come back, run into challenges of funding, like with Texas grants, say they did get it, if they didn't get it in their first year, they're running into the problem of they didn't get it in their first year. they did get it in their first year and they go away for 3 years and they come back, they're running into the time limit on how long you're allowed to get it. Students at private nonprofit institutions that have regional accreditation other than SACS. So you're a private nonprofit in Texas, but your accreditation isn't SACS, it's through Northwest or one of the other regional accreditors. So those are, populations that I've been identifying that they're just not served by any of our programs. Are there any other populations that come to mind? And this is another one that if on your drive back, or if you get back and staff in your office were watching this and they're like, I was trying to text you to make sure you said this one. Please email me. Who are the populations that just aren't served? Not necessarily, or I'm not looking right now at there's just not enough funding, because that's a separate issue. I'm talking about statutorily, there's just no way for them to access any, and I think that's an important thing for us to talk about is who are the people that aren't served, and I'm trying to kind of form a base of that.
I don't have an additional population, but I think the point that you made about the funding, it ties into what I wanted to say. Line 2 is one that I've struggled with quite a bit. Because the idea is if we were to do something with since funding is such an issue, if we were to use less than the proposed target just so that the student would have potential eligibility for remaining years, I can't afford to make up the gap to tuition. Now, I have a little bit different issue going on with our recent tuition guarantee program, but I think that's a concern. And so anything that we bring forward, there would have to be some flexibility. Unless there were funding, we can't be held to having to do this. But I certainly would be wanting to do it.
And that's something that we've noticed, and it comes through when we look at the average grant levels and things like that, like at the 2-year institutions, it's very clear that 2-year institutions aren't just awarding the max to students and then being done, that they're trying to get as many people into the pipeline as possible. I think 4-year institutions are doing it as well, but 4 years we're already working with the recommended grant level as opposed to the maximum piece. So, and that's something that we see overall that, the average, I think, we've got the recommended of 5,000. I think the average award is 4,998 or something like that. So, it's very much occurring. But that is a key piece, and I want to extend my appreciation to all of you to be stretching these dollars and being creative and using your strategic minds to figure out how to get as many people into the process. On the populations not served, another piece that's come up in reading is the lack of portability of our state grants, that someone at a 4-year institution or even a 2-year institution who gets it at one place may not necessarily get it if they transfer to another. Their Pell goes with them, but their state doesn't necessarily go with them, depending on when they apply and when they transfer and all the different eligibility requirements. So if you have other ideas of populations that aren't served, that would be great to help me have a base from which to have discussions within the agency.
Okay. The population I didn't see represented here is our graduate students. That is a challenge for graduate students. We have limited grant funding at our institution for them, but that seems to be a group that they need additional assistance other than loans.
No.
And sorry, my nose. I'm sick to.
I think the transfer students, if a student starts at a 4-year institution, maybe they were even eligible for the Texas grant, and then they come back to a community college. Nothing we can do if they pass their 30. If they pass 30 hours.
Yep.
And it's not just a university to community college; it's community college to community college as well.
I think that's the people who are kind of not in the Texas grant range, but there's still need. So we talk about middle, and it's a big group, but it's middle income families that may, not be able to get in the Texas grant range, but they're not, sitting there with a whole bunch of money, and it's extremely hard, to meet the needs that they have.
Yep. The final thing, the idea that's kind of has come from all the different readings and things like that is work as a resource. I mentioned in here that, the role of work as a resource for financing higher education has changed significantly. Back in the 80s, you could work 20 hours a week at a minimum wage job and pay for your education. Whereas now you would have to work 60 hours a week at a minimum wage job to pay for your education. And so adding on top of that, families from the lowest income levels are often reliant on the earnings of their children to help pay for the family expenses. So the earnings from these students who are getting these need-based scholarships, their families are already depending on them to work to help pay for the family expenses in general, further complicating that role of work as a resource. And so just things, to be considered in analyzing, what are the benefits and drawbacks of the current work-study structure? You've got, on the one hand, the on-campus jobs have been shown to strengthen a student's connection to the institution and support their academic performance. I've also seen things on concerns about the social stigma that comes with having a work-study job and having to serve your classmates in a work role. So there's pros and cons. Those are just two that I put on there. What are the opportunities for a greater connection between state-funded programs and the goals of 60 by 30 techs, in particular the marketable skills as well as the completion of the debts. The way the federal formula works, there's the amount that's protected of their student earnings, and what can we be doing to try to help students earn the maximum amount that they can earn without impacting their eligibility for other need-based programs, and how do we capitalize on current programs, looking at the Texas Works program as it grows, looking at the scope of the Texas Work Study Mentorship Program. There is a endowment internship program that exists in statute, but there's only one institution in the state that's actually reporting that they're collecting money that would go towards that program, because it's a fee-based program and stuff. So it's kind of a dormant program. But just, are there opportunities for the state to rethink work as a resource for financing higher education? Is the traditional work-study model? I know that there's been there was an article a while back of I wish I could remember the name of it, but basically, is the work study, ripe for recreation, or has it passed its prime at this point? And as I say that, please keep in mind that, I spent my first decade working in work study and was president of the Northeast Association and was a trainer on work study. So, it's not that I don't like work study, it's just asking the question of, have times changed that the work-study model created 50 years ago, does it or doesn't it serve the actual needs of students at this point in terms of financing education? So those are pieces, and I wanted you to know about those pieces that are starting to be talked about. As I said, none of these are things that we have said we are absolutely taking these anywhere forward. They're just, you got to have discussions in order to eventually get to a place of making recommendations. And so don't be surprised if I call any of you to ask your thoughts on these things. Don't hesitate to email me on any of these things. And I look forward to discussions and from hearing from the subcommittee as to the subcommittee's thoughts on opportunities, not just for correction but for improvement.
Thank you. So, I'm sorry.
Oh, it looked like you were about to put your hand on it. Hold something. Sorry.
Well, since you mentioned it, Chad. So since this is my last meeting, I would hope that maybe you might consider adding to that list on the TEOG matching, bringing Texas Grant and TEOG into alignment a little bit, especially with the fact that TEOG, we're not allowed to use the Pell Grants as match, which causes us to shift funding from other students that we could be helping to help a student that already has maybe a full Pell Grant and the TEOG. So.
I support that too. That may come as a total surprise to you, Chad.
Actually, Alan, you beat me to it. I was going to make the suggestion.
And what I've written down here, because I had a section on federal alignment, and I think that piece adds the broader question of just state alignment. Within our programs, what opportunities would be beneficial by having greater alignment between our 3 grant programs versus what aspects really are unique to the programs. Very consciously, there wasn't the Texas Grant priority model is for Texas Grant, not for TEOG, because it would have a very different impact. And the question has definitely come up within the in discussions about that very piece on the matching of, there's 2 ways you can look at it. One is for Pell recipients, allowing that Pell to be available for the other costs of education if their tuition and fees are covered. And so making sure that those neediest students aren't just getting their tuition and fees covered, but they're getting even more than their tuition and fees covered. The alternate being utilizing the Pell towards that. From that standpoint, for your highest Pell students, does that simply mean they don't receive any TEOG because their tuition and fees are all covered by a maximum Pell? And so trying to figure out, I think there's a deeper question of what are we trying to achieve with our state grant programs? And that's a conversation that's started as well. And that's a conversation that's occurring as many organizations look at promise programs. And the promise programs have really pushed this idea of making sure tuition and fees are covered. In addition, you've got the tuition and fees covered for a student. Does that allow them to actually attend? Are they able to attend if just their tuition and fees are covered? A student with a 0 EFC, and you say, okay, well, your tuition and fees are covered. Does that really allow them to attend? And at the agency, the question would be even more than just does it allow them attend, does it allow them to succeed? Does it allow them to complete? And so I think there's the broader question of what should our grant programs be trying to achieve? Is it just trying to achieve covering tuition and fees? Should we be trying to achieve something more than that? Should it be trying to just create greater flexibility for institutions to use as they see fit? There's lots of different pieces that come into play on this because there's the should Pell count towards the matching, but then go back to Diane's question, should the matching be there in the first place if we're trying to look at some of these other pieces? So it's a very interconnected conversation that I'm going to be trying to involve all sorts of people over the next year in trying to figure out so that when we go forward, if we suggest any changes, we really can state what the goal is that we're trying to accomplish. Because add on top of it this idea that TEA is now paying for or providing funding so that every high school student can take one test ACT, SAT, or TSIA, covered, that every high school student will have filed a FAFSA for graduation, that high schools will receive additional funding for every student that they graduate who's, is it career, college, or military ready? I think that's the phrase. I just can never remember which C is first, college or career. College, career, or career, college, military. So there's all sorts of pieces that have the potential to significantly change our college enrollments. And so, it'd be one thing to try to think about all these things, everything being the status quo, but trying to think about all these things with the potential that we're going to see a significant difference in our college enrollment in the next biennium and the following. So keep me informed of your thoughts. I'm sorry, was there more thoughts before I
just, one other area maybe to think about is when you mention state programs, I didn't hear mention of exemptions and waiver programs and how those interact with other programs, either formally or informally. So I think that's another area of discussion, because I see a lot of students who we're seeking to help. We have our programs in place, and then all of a sudden their tuition and fees are fully covered, and yet what do I do with the other aid that they have? Unless they go over full cost of attendance, doesn't appear to be guidance as to what I should do with that. And possibly the state, because those are in a sense all state funds, maybe there should be some guidance.
That's just its own little tangled web.
I know it is.
And I'm going to leave it at that.
I realize it's complicated.
Anything else? Okay, the next item is the acknowledgement of the folk who have been on the committee whose terms are ending. First off, I just want to give my thanks to the 5 people that I'm about to read your names. Your participation, guidance, assistance, discussion has just been invaluable and greatly appreciated. If you will, after the meeting, if you'll come up and see Chad and myself, we do have a few parting gifts. So.
Surprise, surprise. You get a mug.
Well, you also get a letter of thanks and a certificate. So if you will just come up afterwards. The first is Zelma De Leon, representing 4-year public, Delisa Falks, who has represented TASFA, Bridget Jans, 4-year public, Alan Pixie, 2-year public, and Kara Terpendorf, Pflugerville ISD. Thank you all. Then the next is transition of leadership. I now get to officially hand this off to Robert. You are now the chair. And if you will take care of the adjournment for us.
Sure, thank you. But before we move to adjournment or ask a question to adjourn, I would like to, give thanks to Diane for being a great leader. I think you did a great, you had a great year in the position. And I'm particularly thankful for including me in the various conversations, because I think you prepared me to take over the responsibility. So thank you. And I would like to ask the committee to, show gratitude for her service, with a, clap. All righty, so now the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. Has been moved and second to adjourn. Those in favor? Aye. Aye. Motion passes. Oh, I'm sorry, an announcement before we leave. The next meeting is November 21st.